Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. We are day two into the end of democracy. By the time you listen, this will be day three into the end of democracy. The
Wow.
executive orders has been signed. The war report is getting shut down via executive
Mm.
order. Uh, it's I'm sorry, but it's over for us. Don't worry. We'll continue our pirate broadcast from I don't know. I'm sure we have
Yeah.
some source out there. Maybe Kamchatka, somewhere they can't find us. But,
Kamchatka.
uh,
That's right.
Look, I'm just saying. When you think of the far reaches of just like desolate Russia, where else do you think of except Kamchatka?
Yeah, you
It's
haven't
perfect.
heard of Chukchi radio, but you will.
It's perfect, and that might be the future of the war report going forward. Because yeah, I look. We're not big enough to make enemies, but if we were bigger, we would have enemies. I'll put it that way. So you know what? I think with that being said, let's prove why we should have enemies if we were bigger.
Yes. Yeah, we certainly will. Well, why don't we begin with the frontline uh maps? Actually, you know what? Let me just interrupt. It just occurred to me. So, I joke about my arch enemy Romanos. He's not. He's a good friend. He's a wonderful guy, and he's my brother in Christ. And his uncle Tony passed away, and I would ask people to please pray for his uncle Tony's soul
Oh, of course.
in eternal memory. Thank you. But let's proceed. So we begin with the frontline maps, and we're going to begin from the south and work to the north. And the first is Velika Novoselka. So the Russians have made some gains there over the past week. You can see the black outlines, and then the red gun uh, icons. They represent smaller gains where they've encroached further into Vremevka. They took over this week after our last show. They've taken over Neskuchne and most of Vremevka, but there's uh, Velika Novoselka, the village proper after that name. They've begun encroaching there. The next slide will clear things up. You can see where the gains have been made, and there now the difficult part here is for the Ukrainians. The ones at the very bottom are well and truly in big trouble. Um, uh, History Legend did do a good video about how on two different occasions the Ukrainians managed to avoid losing many men in encirclement, as they did in Ugledar in Kurachovo. Uh, and I think that's what they're hoping to accomplish here in Novoselka, but Velika Novoselka. But this is going to be much more difficult because there is only really one entry point for Ukrainians to come in and to rescue those guys at the bottom of this village complex, as you can see. And um, there is a river that divides it, and you can see on the left side of this urban agglomeration, it's really not that urban to begin with, but that is a river, and crossing it will be very difficult. So this would give the Russians a very good idea from which direction they would have to come in order to help clear out the guys that are in this complex of villages. But the Ukrainians say that they are confident they will get out. Of course, a lot of new guys probably might believe them that they will. But remember that for the Battle of Ugledar, 50% of all who tried to flee were lost. And in Avdiivka, at least 900 were captured, and I don't know how many were killed. That was very significant because that was the highest number since the Ukrainians lost Mariupol. Next, we're going to go to Pokrovsk, and we're going to take a look at what's developing there. As you can see, the Russians are forming this kind of crescent around Pokrovsk. They have cut off one of the railroad and roads leading to it. And to the east of it, as you can see, by that black outline, where we have also the gun logo, the gun emojis, I guess. That is another area where the Russians have been building up more and more. This area is almost directly halfway between Toretsk and Pokrovsk. Now, I outlined in red Konstantinovka because that's really like that's a very big town. It's bigger than Pokrovsk, but you can see what the Russians are probably doing. They want to go around that fortification complex and they want to create another crescent next to the crescent that is sort of cradling Pokrovsk and then work from the sides, constantly from the sides, and cut off supplies. So um, we'll go to the next slide, which is the southern part of Pokrovsk that you could hardly see from the slide we just looked at previously. So this is just north of Korakhovo. The Russians are basically shaping the battlefield for Andreevka. Um, they're going to Sribne, and they also captured a few days ago, yes, Yasenove, and what's the other one that they captured? Petropavlivka, but that was about a week ago. So small, steady gains. The pace of the gains are less than what they were before the end of the year. The Russians were averaging something like 36 to 39 square kilometers a day. They're down to about 22. I don't know if that's partly the weather. I don't know if that's the Ukrainians are more effective at defending or there's a rotation going on, but it could be a combination or any one of those three things. The next slide shows you the area just north of Andreevka with the heavy fortifications. The Russians made a gain there yesterday as well, and they're gonna go around the north and south side of this line of fortifications as well. Now, just let's move back up to where we were previously, that I was talking about, that area in between Pokrovsk and Toretsk. This slide will show you how this battlefield is shaping up. Okay, so you can see that there's four big circles. The one that has no red in it, of course, that's Konstantinovka. The little circle next to it, that's Chasov Yar. The one below Chasov Yar is Toretsk. Toretsk, of course, has been completely captured, but Russians have made more gains in the suburbs of Toretsk, or not suburbs, but let's say towns just outside of it. And then this area north of Ochertina, roughly speaking, that's where it is. Um, so if we go to the next slide, I can give you the name. Yeah, Baranovka. Baranovka is the latest village that they captured. It is a village that is directly in between Pokrovsk and Toretsk. Finally, let's move to Toretsk. You can see that the entirety of Toretsk has been captured, and now the Russians are working in Novospaska and Leonidovka. They've captured the rest of Leonidovka, and they're going to keep working northernly. And I would say the real test will come when they get to Konstantinovka, because do you attack Konstantinovka or do you stop and start moving westward to try to in, um, envelop all those troops in that second crescent that I'm talking about? Um, I don't know. We're going to have to see. Yes. Next slide has a bit of a blow up of the Toretsk region. Konstantin, if you want to take a look at it, I don't know if the zoom helps, but it'll give you an idea the amount of fortifications that the Russians have captured. This area is less it's less urban than Toretsk is, obviously. There might be some high rises, but not 10 stories high. No industrial stuff that I'm aware of. New York might have had that, which is much further south. Next, we move to Chasov Yar. The Russians have made some gains in the forest belt, and they have taken over. I said last week that they took over that industrial plant, and they've moved further around it until really now the only way to get in here is to either scrape very close between the Russian presence and the water reservoir, or loop all the way around. In either case, the Russians know what direction, if there is a force that would relieve and allow Ukrainians to evacuate, which direction they're coming from. The next slide will show you. a little bit better what I'm talking about. Yeah. And then yeah, so take that in. So you can see that there is an area that the Ukrainians control next to the water reservoir. There are lots of high rises there. Now the Russians control some of the high rises, but most of the high rises are controlled by the Ukrainians. And then that forest belt, which is actually very strategic for behind enemy line strikes on the Russians. So this is an area that the Russians have to take over, I think, if they want to keep proceeding. Now, over 50% of Chasiv Yar is already taken, and it is the highest ground in all of Donbass. So if there is going to be an attack on Konstantinovka, they would have to take over Chasiv Yar first. And taking over the forest belt is important because we saw just how many failed attempts the Russians had trying to take over Sinkovka by ignoring the forest belt. Whoever the general was there, honestly, should be fired if not court-martialed. But and then the next slide is a close-up of the forest belt. You can see in this next slide the close-up the areas that the Russians control in the black outline. That's an apartment block that you see there, but the rest of it is also an apartment block going on a diagonal, northwest by southeast. And that is Chasov Yar for now. Next, we move to Kursk. And um, the Ukrainians have been successful in taking back some of the villages in the Suja area. They've pushed the Russians back, and I believe Makhanovo. Um, the outline is obscured, but the Russians have made gains in other areas. The yellow outline is Ukrainian gains, and the black outlines are Russian gains. About 60% of the territory that Ukraine used to control in Kursk has been retaken by the Russians. But yeah, this is a small blow up. Now there is a river here. Those on the east side of these villages like Mala Lokhnia um, is a river, and it's quite open on the other side. There's very little. There's very few places to hide except the forest belts. I would presume that there are a significant amount of troops to, let's say, more in the southwest from here, in places like Pravda, which is just south of Stolovaya. Anyhow, we'll see. We'll see what happens. I Now the Russians have never made any claims that they're going to take that they wanted to take Kursk by January the 20th. Those are claims Ukraine made that their secret intelligence said Putin said, or one of the like. I mean, this country is just
But
ridiculous.
that's the
So
entirety of this war. 3 days
yes,
to Kiev, that was made up by Milley. All of these
yes,
talking points. Look, I know there's and we were talking about this off air, the debate about Russian red lines. They do exist, clearly. That's the reason why the West is not directly at war with Russia, at least beyond, say, the missile strikes. But most of the red lines you hear about Russia are imposed either by some clown in the West or some clown in Ukraine, and it's just that simple. We have the utmost confidential source. The Russians said XYZ. That they said, oh, there's going to be hell to pay this time. All of it goes back to, like I said, some clown politician or military official in the West or in Ukraine.
yeah, yeah. It's like if Russia has no red lines, then go into Ukraine. I mean, you're telling me that America, Britain, Germany, and France can't scrounge together 250,000 men to send there, so to relieve the Ukrainians who are like, I don't know, waiting around the border with Belarus or Kiev or some of the other towns. Like, go relieve them. Go, go, just do it. Instead of just your special ops and mercenaries, just go and do it. But they won't. Anyhow, um, so next is Kupiansk, and now this is interesting because about a month ago, some of the gains the Russians made here they were pushed out, but the Russians have been persistent, and they have not only retaken where they were pushed out, but they've doubled on the amount of territory that they've taken. And I've outlined where Kupiansk is in the little red down at the bottom of the frame. The Russians are going to want to keep expanding this area and then start moving south. As I said on previous shows, there's literally only one bridge left that connects West Kupiansk to East Kupiansk. So it would be like a suicide mission to try to get those guys over the Oskol River. If there were hardly any defenders in Kupiansk, yeah, maybe, but that's not the case. So so it's a long ways away, but the Russians are persisting. They're still developing this area. And the next slide will show you the various villages that they've captured over the last week or so. Sahunovka, Kurpichne, Rakovo, Dibrivka. That's fun. The Ukrainian spelling is just hilarious to me. Instead of Dobrovka, it's Dibrivka.
Oh,
It's
that's
just,
atrocious.
yeah, it's just come on, Ukraine. Okay, so, anyways, and that's it for the frontline news. Um, yes, so there's I mean, Trump has been inaugurated. I don't know what do you want to cover next? Do you want to?
Well, I suppose what would fit next is Trump's most immediate comments on Ukraine. I want to hold
Yeah.
off, if not cover any of the domestic stuff on Trump. I'm not saying I don't want to touch all this episode, but it's not going to be a priority because of the focus of the show. Once again, mostly looking towards global events and the role of Trump in these. I'm not saying that we won't touch those either later today or some point in the future, but I want to focus primarily on his comments on Ukraine because I think there's a couple different ways they can be read. So I know for starters, I'll look up his official post on it when it comes to the entire paragraph upon paragraph of what he said. But one of the first things he said when asked about it is he parroted the line that the Russians had lost up to 1 million people at this point. And the Ukrainians 700,000. And once again,
Oh yeah, yeah, of
these are
course.
numbers right out of the intelligence agencies, right out of the Pentagon, stuff that they've been parroting for a
They
number.
wouldn't lie.
No, of course not. And it does bring up the question: was this just a public-facing comment? Is he trying to put on an image of strength, or is he trying to prime the pump for negotiations, as it were? Or does he actually just take what the intelligence agencies give him at face value? And I think there's a case to be said for both. I mean, I don't think Trump is the greatest foreign policy mind, as we've seen from his first term, as we've seen from some of his comments. Not stupid by any means. I know a lot of people want to paint him as a moron, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. But I could very easily see whatever State Department or Pentagon or CIA official putting some intelligence briefing on his desk saying, look, here's the official numbers. Russia's economy is on the ropes. We just need to put a little bit more pressure, and we'll bring them to the bargaining table. Uh, yeah, there's an argument for that either way, which I think we talked about this before, especially when we brought on Kellogg, when he brought on Rubio. His approach to peace in Ukraine, which unfortunately he did not get in the first 24 hours, as he insisted he would. I mean, I don't think anyone really believed that, is really the good cop, bad cop thing, where I'm going to get a bunch of these scary guys. They're going to threaten you with economic annihilation. Russia's going to be sent back to the 1990s. I suppose he wouldn't use those exact terms, but that's pretty much what the implicit threat is. Or you can talk to me. You can talk to Donald, the nice deal maker who wants to, shake your hands and have a Big Mac with you. That's Trump's negotiating strategy. We saw this with North Korea. We saw this with his attempted negotiations with Iran. And we even saw this with some of his trade negotiations with other quote unquote allied countries like Canada, like Europe, the European nations during his first term, and certainly with the Chinese as well, where it is very much that good cop, bad cop approach. That's why he brought Bolton on. And I'm not talking about the efficacy of this approach. I'm not talking about whether I support it or not, but I'm just simply stating this is what Donald Trump does. And the fruits of that, I think that is to be determined. But here's the post he put on his Truth Social account. I said Truth Social. It kills me every time. It's I'm not looking to hurt Russia. I love the Russian people. Have
No.
always had a good relationship with
Oh
Putin.
yeah.
And despite the
Some of
radical
my best
left's
friends are
Russia
Russians.
hoax, we will never forget that Russia helped us win the Second World War, losing
Ah.
almost 60 million lives in the process. Now, for history autists out there, which I imagine is probably the majority, if not all of you, 60 million is the estimated casualties in total for both fronts, both in Europe and the Pacific.
Yeah,
Uh,
27 for Russia, including like civilians,
yeah,
soldiers, everything.
I think the figure is about 11 million in military, and then another 16 million in terms of civilian casualties from secondary
Yes,
effects, whether it be starvation, breakdown of
yes.
infrastructure, strikes on civilian targets, etc. But not to get too caught up on the point in the process. All that being said, I'm going to do Russia, whose economy he capitalized economy. Here, I'll put this on the screen for you guys, so we can go ahead and get that
He's
up right
such an
here.
idiot.
So,
You know, he thought in after the inauguration, he thought Spain was in BRICS. Can
Franco
you
would have
imagine?
put Spain in bricks.
Yes, Franco would have. Can you imagine somebody has a plumicide, sir? You're thinking of Brazil. It's not.
Uh, okay, so here I have the post up. I'll continue reading. You can see a capitalized economy on it. And President Putin, a very big favor. Settle now and stop this ridiculous war. It's
Oh
only
yeah.
going to get worse. If we don't make a quote unquote deal in quotation marks, and soon I will have no choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being
Oh
sold by Russia
no.
to the United States. But would you want to point out that, okay, Russia is already under probably the maximum number of U.S. sanctions that wouldn't overtly harm the United States. Now we've seen the secondary effects of sanctions in the U.S. So that's a non-starter. Tariffs, that's implying there's any significant degree of trade between the U.S. and Russia left, and at that point you'd be tariffing oil, which
Well, it's uranium.
yeah, oil and uranium is really the two big things. In which case, once again, you're just shooting yourself in the foot with that one.
Yep.
On a thing being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. Let's get this war, which would have never started if I were president, over
Oh, of
with.
course.
I mean,
Yeah,
I,
because Putin would have been scared, too
I
scared.
mean, yes, I know the angle is going for, but I honestly do think that Trump probably would have refrained from giving Zelensky a blank check. I'll just say that much.
Yeah,
Um,
I think because there, there was something was going on. I mean, the second impeachment against Trump, just over delaying aid to Ukraine, delaying aid,
and I'll
right?
point out that that was actually the first impeachment was over delaying aid to Ukraine. Second impeachment
Was it?
was over
Oh,
January 6th.
oh
But
yes,
but
yes, yes. I'm sorry.
But I do want to
Yes.
point out something I realized actually just right after the election because somebody brought it up to me, is that during the time when Trump threatened to withhold aid from Ukraine, he was on the Mirotrovic kill list. The Ukrainian
Yes.
intelligence
Yes.
had him on a hit list,
That's right.
and
That's right.
the the response was I might withhold aid, and once again trying to withhold aid to or threatening to withhold aid or delay aid, I should say, to a country that had him on a hit list. Now we hear endlessly about how the Iranians tried to take him out, want to take
Oh
out
yeah,
John
yeah.
Bolton, whatever. But the Ukrainians had publicly listed that they wanted to take him out. I don't know what else to say. But blah blah blah. We can do it the easy way or the hard way. See, he's trying to do the good cop, bad cop
Yeah,
thing
yeah, yeah.
again. And the easy way is always better. It's time to make a deal. No more lives should be lost. I mean, Trump is trying to do what this reminds me of with Russia, what he did with North Korea, not realizing the differences, complete differences in dynamics. And truthfully, given North Korea's, I would say, reconciliation with both Russia and China, where it is becoming part of at least that block of international politics, his threats towards North Korea today probably wouldn't have worked like they did in 2017, 2018. And I do think that Trump is approaching this like he's talking to a secondary or tertiary power, like the Iranians or the North Koreans, and not the Russians, who, number one, had the ability to even launch this operation in the first place. Number two, are sweeping the Ukrainians on the battlefield. Now, of course, that does come at a cost. I'm not going to downplay Russian losses here. It has been a hard fought war, the most brutal one since World War II for them. But nonetheless, they are decisively winning. I don't think there's any question about that on the battlefield. I don't think there's any question about that diplomatically. And, I mean, like I said, I know Trump's angle perfectly well. And Putin's response is, of course, we want to talk. We just need to set the terms for negotiations. But once again, it doesn't seem like, at least coming from the White House, and I know that Trump has been in office for like 72 hours, so it's kind of hard to really gauge at this point. But so far, it doesn't seem like there's any, at least, public acknowledgement of trying to at least reach terms in which they can negotiate with the Russians. And that also brings up the other point that while Putin will play coy, while he will, of course, for appearances, and maybe for a genuine desire to see this settled in a cleaner way, and I'll get into the reason for that in just a moment, is willing to entertain the peace talks, what we end up seeing is, once again, especially if the concessions on NATO membership are not made, not a delay, not a moratorium, but outright just refusal of NATO membership to Ukraine, then there's nothing to negotiate about. Russia will continue the drive to the Dnieper, and if they do come up on that, once again, we're talking about occupying the better half of Zaporozhye. We're talking about coming up on the outskirts of Kiev. We're talking about, once again, these major cities. Odessa is another one. If the Russians do continue this drive towards the Dnieper that they're doing on some fronts, we're just talking about in a maximalist sense here. I'm not talking about direct Russian strategy, but just painting a broad picture, talking grand strategy here.
Things that could happen,
Yes, things that could happen.
not necessarily will happen.
Yes, thank you for specifying for me. But with that, once again, if the Russians continue on the current course, there's not much that can be done in the way of Ukraine. And realistically, the biggest desire for a ceasefire in the West, aside from a few voices of sanity who do genuinely want to see this thing end, think somebody like Orban. I know that Hungary straddles east and west, so that might not be a fair example. Same with Slovakia. But okay, European and American voices, transatlantic voices, if you will. Insert your preferred term, I suppose. But what you see with that, aside from a few of the um, sober-minded, level-headed individuals, the desire for a ceasefire in Ukraine, say that you hear maybe out of some parts of Western Europe or even some parts of the United States, even if they agree to a moratorium on NATO membership, it is for the rearmament of Ukraine, so they can scoop up these 18-year-old conscripts and give them enough training to actually hold the line and not just have a fighting retreat, because that's what we see from the Ukrainians right now, and to properly rearm the country and rebuild the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, of course, the Russians would do the same. They would be rearming themselves. But they want to re-entrench Ukraine. That's the main push behind the idea of a ceasefire in the West. At which point, the Russians, the winds are completely at their sails. And sure, you can talk about some bigger problems. You can talk about their inflation rates, which I do think there's cause for concern. You can talk about maybe some long-term economic prospects and what their economy will look like post-war, as you do have. I'm no economic expert, but you look at countries that come out of major wars, the economy can be um, very versatile, very fragile in that sense, and you can see a large upturn in unemployment, for example, with a lot of people being dismissed from military service. But you did send an interesting statistic about Russia's economy right now, so
So this is from Bloomberg.
I'll go ahead and
Y-
get that
y-
up.
y- Yeah, because Bloomberg is on Russia's side, right?
Well, funny enough, just as an aside, it was quite funny because Mike Bloomberg, when he was teasing a run for president in 2016, did propose that Ukraine should be partitioned along the Dnieper as a solution to the Maidan, which I think, I mean, not that he would ever say it today. And I will say, while I'm on the same side, I do think it's very sad that Bloomberg was not the Democratic nominee in 2020 and not the one that they shoehorned in there, because I think he would have been a very entertaining president, to say the least.
Yeah.
His debates with Trump would have been golden. Imagine just like two loudmouth New Yorkers, one of them being, of course, of a certain ethnicity, just going at each other. That would have been beautiful. But I'm getting sidetracked. I have the chart up here, and it does show Russia's budget revenue, and you can see right there in black is the oil and gas, and blue is, of course, the other sectors of the economy, where you can see that, yes, Russian dependency on its energy sector is decreasing. It's no longer an economy that it relies on one resource. Not that it ever was, but once again, you can see these spikes, say towards 2022, and even going back further, where their energy sector was probably the golden goose of their economy, if you will, and that
Mm.
does seem to have changed to a significant degree. But once again, we're looking at the situation. Everyone, now that Trump is in office, and I'm sure, I know that Starmer and Macron are going on their I don't know, probably their quarterly rant about sending peacekeepers to Ukraine, whatever, or the British 100-year treating with Ukraine, all of that.
Mhm.
But once again, I think once everything starts to settle, once Trump really resettles back into the role and that he gets himself acclimated with the Europeans. I know that Tusk was talking about going over and visiting and sending Sikorsky, whatever. But once that settles, I imagine the Europeans will probably reluctantly still go along with Trump's so-called peace proposal and so-called ceasefire proposal because what else are the Europeans to do? They're not going to be able to sustain this war effort on their own. You might get a few hawks on the continent who want to continue to do so, but realistically, it's just simply not going to happen. You look at the lion's share of both military and financial aid supplied to the Ukrainians, it's the U.S. Even Trump's moratorium on foreign aid for 90 days made an exception for Ukraine. However, there are rumors, and I haven't seen any confirmation, of arms shipments being halted until they agree to negotiation terms, in which case, as Trump said, once the Russians deny it, we'll have to send more aid to Ukraine than ever, which, once again, you have to wonder uh, what
Right?
exactly. And I think that
What have they been holding back for
yeah,
3 years?
what have they been holding back? And I do think the biggest point we need to bring up, especially with Elon Musk and how buddy he's been with Trump, is that the Ukrainian communication infrastructure at this point is still entirely reliant on Starlink, and
Hmm.
that if Trump is serious about this, if he really wants to cut off the Ukrainians, he needs to give Elon Musk a phone call and needs to say cut off Starlink. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime in the near future. But what I do think the general strategy is, whether that be from Trump, whether that be from his foreign policy team, is yes, they do want a ceasefire, and they want that time to rearm Ukraine. And even some people who are less of Russia hawks, say like Trump, say like some of the people more sympathetic to him, are willing to, I don't know, shelve the issue for 20 years, as they say with the NATO moratorium, and focus on the Middle East and China, Middle East and Asia Pacific more broadly. But with that being said, looking at that, the where do I even begin with this? Because I'm sorry, there's a lot of
It's
components here
okay.
to to dissect. But with that, with Trump putting Ukraine on the back burner, rearming them, etc., he does also want to shift the onus onto the Europeans. That's something he has said a number of times. But the question is,
I love it. An American idea becomes a European problem. It's just
and
incredible.
the
It's
worst
just
part is, there's plenty of Europeans like Starmer, like Macron, who will gladly take that up and think that it's the greatest thing ever. That strategic autonomy is doing the bidding of the American foreign policy establishment. And like I said, you'll get these, and whoever that, what's his name, Merz, running in Germany right now for chancellor, who will pick up this idea, who will kiss at the feet of the State Department, of the Pentagon, and say, "Oh, thank you so much for allowing this opportunity," but also spitting at the same time, condemning the Americans for their brazenness. Well, once again, also doing everything they ask of them. It is pathetic, and I know the Europeans don't have many options, but frankly, it just is pathetic.
like, do you remember before this war started, and even as it started, do you remember just how heated the debates were about taking Russia off the SWIFT thing? Just the SWIFT. Do you remember that?
Yes, yes.
Do you really think Europe was for this? They were never for this.
No, no. Europe was not for this, but
This
it
is literally something the Americans did.
oh,
It
absolutely.
it forced them. It forced them because, well, I'm going to show you something about, let's say GDP from like 1980 to 2025. So I'm gonna send you this graph, and you can see just how close the United States and the EU have been in terms of like GDP to purchasing power. Okay, GDP to PVP, share of world percentage of growth, or it's basically what you can really buy in your own country where you live, right? Okay, so as you can see, from 1980 to definitely 1995 and probably into 1996, the European Union, the average person in the European Union had a better life than a person in the US, higher purchasing power. But then I would say around 2000 it starts to overlap. In 2005, the Europeans go above just by a little bit, and then they continue to go above. You can see just how close, because then America overtakes them rather around 2008. Well, what happened in 2008? Oh, that was the crash, right? That was the crash, and then a little bit later, America helps destroy Libya, and then they go after Syria. All the migrants start flooding in. All the people who pretend they're migrants start flooding
And this
in.
also, I should point out, coincides with Eastern expansion of the EU, where they do take on more of these countries that are less economically developed at a time when they're already strained. And they
Yes,
take on, I mean, Poland was a bit earlier, but they take on a lot of these Balkan states and a lot of these other Eastern European states. On top of their already decline, they're accepting more of a financial burden because, once again, they don't want to risk the Russians setting foot in there because the Russians might reestablish themselves in Eastern Europe and actually be a serious player on the continent. Not that they weren't beforehand, but just that eternal fear that the Russians were going to just gain a foothold and we'd have to deal with them. Well, I mean, look at where you are now. Look at where you are right now.
right, right. And so I guess what I'm saying is the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, like effectively. I mean, I don't know if Trump would have done it. I don't know if Trump would have done it. I'm sure
No,
he's
because he
glad
would have
Biden.
sanctioned it before it even happened.
Oh yeah, that's right. I mean, he did, but Germany wasn't going to go through with it.
No, no.
I mean, they weren't going to listen to him. In fact, the reason Biden did this to Germany is because he knew that Germany would disobey Blumph, right? So all I'm saying is this war has been entirely brought upon Europe by the U.S. The U.S. did this.
Oh,
Okay,
absolutely. And it's
right, and you can see in the graph GDP to purchasing power that the reason they did it is because they're. I mean, both the EU and America have declining lifestyles, but at one point the people in the EU had a better life, had better prosperity than the US, with all things considered. Buying groceries, rent, uh, how many days of the week you could have off, all those things, quality of life issues, right? And now it's been often said that uh, yes, but it came at the expense of America protecting Europe. First of all, nobody was threatening Europe.
no, no.
Not even the Soviet Union.
I look
Okay,
at the pipeline
the,
deals between Europe and the Soviet Union. Those were built in the
the Soviet Union was
60s.
destroyed. The Russians lost 27 million people. Well, the Soviets did. They weren't all Russians, obviously, but most of the destruction was all in Eastern Europe, right? Far worse than Western Europe, right? And like these are the guys that were like supposed to they were supposed to no, America made them a boogeyman in order for Europe to buy. Well, I mean, part of it was to merge American and British and European markets, obviously, banking cartels and all that kind of thing, right? And to expand American influence. And of course, there was the Lend-Lease program. And Stalin said, "We're not paying you back. We already paid in blood. We lost 27 million people," and which I've always respected him for doing, because, like, and of course, naturally, the Americans got very upset because the Jewish bankers were very upset that they lost all this money.
Well, do you want to see the
Uh,
other side of Lend-Lease? The other country that received an immense amount of U.S. aid, probably just as much, if not more, than the
yeah, yeah,
Soviets, was the British. And
that's
let's
right.
let's look at the state of the British today, who decided to pay the Americans back, who decided to do things the quote unquote right
That's
way.
right.
They're no more
That's
than a
right.
colony of their former colony.
That's right. And then, I mean, just the narrative, just the Jewish narrative in this is hilarious, right? So, like any other people, like you look at the poor Albanians and the Ukrainians, right? Whose savior is literally America. I mean, there was never a genocide against them. Like all they have like some scrappy piece of land that they've always wanted, and America came in, built a NATO base, and took the land away from whatever other country in order that they could be happy. And even in Albania, which had nothing to do with it, because remember, it was Kosovo and Albania, to different apparently countries. They have plaques and statues to Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, right? So the Russians lose millions. They go into these concentration camps. Like there's no war. There's no thank you. There's no memorial. There's no nothing. Nothing. It's like it never happened. It's like nothing was ever discovered there, right? You look at you look at the Ukrainians, and like they're renaming streets. I mean, I don't know if it was a joke, but one of them was an American porn star, right?
Ugh. I mean, probably
But
not,
like,
frankly, but
but do you know what I mean?
yes,
And
yes.
and so why should they? And
Or
of
name your
course,
children F-16 and Patriot.
right. And so I guess what I'm saying is like it's always been in America's interest to make Russia the boogeyman, to keep Europe occupied, like on America's side, because America well knows like an integrated Europe with energy and let's say manufacturing from Russia going into Europe is not good for certain groups. And that's why they have to keep this region divided forever, because they would be on the periphery, right?
Yes, and
And that's all this is. And that's why of course I don't like and respect Stalin overall, but he has done a few things along the way that I do have to respect. And of course, the other one was killing Trotsky. That was crazy.
uh, yeah,
Not paying back American Jewish bankers. Absolutely based, right? Absolutely based. Because if you just look at the timeline, it's kind of hilarious, right? Trotsky leaves his New York apartment. We don't know who's paying for it, right? And he's going to go back. He's been given the cue to help start the revolution in Russia, right? And he's stopped by the Canadians in Halifax, and he's kept there for weeks. And I believe it's is it MI5? It should be MI6, and it's William Wiseman. He's not Jewish, he's British.
yeah.
He's
Wiseman's
the
could
local.
very easily be
Yeah,
an Anglo last name.
yeah, absolutely. And he is the station chief in New York, who says no, he's going, right? And he goes. I don't know if he went through Lenin's route into. Anyhow, so they foment this revolution. Of course, the Americans and like the British, they sit on their asses. They don't do anything because they want the country balkanized, right? Trotsky. I'm going to send you another map. Okay, so um, of course, at this time, because there was a war in the early 19th century between Iran and Russia. And the both the Russians and the British had let's say interests in Iran, especially after the Industrial Revolution. The Russians basically held interest in the north, the British in the south. And when they decided to help out, they were going to save they were going to save the White Russia. This is so hilarious. Trotsky literally gave them the northern part of Iran, all to the British. Right. This is where the first oil fields were discovered in the world. When you consider the Industrial Revolution was only about 100 years old at that time. Well, maybe 125 years old. That's very important. And so, I mean, that was a joke. And of course, then it was. Um, uh, Lloyd George when he went to Murmansk, who gave them permission. Oh, it must have been the whites, right? No, Trotsky gave them permission, right? And how about that spy? Winston Churchill's cousin, Claire Sheridan. I mean, Claire Sheridan was a trollop, and she had an affair with Trotsky. She even admitted in her memoirs, right?
Oh,
All of
match
these
made in
people
hell.
were all of these people were interested in, and I just think it's funny that all this effort to do this to the Russian people, to foment on them, and really this is the tag to all those years that we've talked about the Salisbury plan that was pitched to George V.
in the 1890s about why they had to destroy Russia. This is all part of it. This is all part of it. Um, I'm sorry for some listeners, they're not going to want to hear this, but there's always been, ever since Oliver Cromwell, a strong alliance between Anglos and Jews, and they have always done this. And you even see a microcosm of this where you have that, who is that guy with the Koresh AVI on Twitter? He's just disgusting. The guy says always something.
all these people blend together, but go on.
Yeah. So he had a tweet, stick with the Zionists, you'll win, right? The truth is like, I don't know, a lot of these Anglo countries, like, some of their pride does come from being financed by Jewish bankers, right? Essentially. But they had it in for Tsar Nicholas, and they had it in for Russia. And even before the war really took off, when Alfred Milner in 1917 met with Tsar Nicholas, he told him, like, you can't even have a parliament and a monarchy that we do. You have to completely abdicate, right? Even the Bolsheviks offered him to go back, and of course the British press were furious. We can't have a tyrant like Tsar Nicholas II, like that. So much for loyalty from the British
Oh
crown.
yeah, just look at
Absolutely pathetic.
just look
And
at
so,
Anglosphere propaganda, like around
yes,
the 1905
yeah,
up revolt, and also to touch on your point, I think the most glaring example was striking that fissure between the rest of continental Europe, particularly the Germans, and to a lesser extent the Austrians, and the Russians as well. Because you look at Bismarck's foreign policy, he had just established Germany. They were the premier country on the continent. And his goal, first and foremost in foreign policy, was peace in the East. That a war between Germany and Russia would lead to the destruction of both. So it is in the mutual interest of both for a peaceful and friendly relationship. But once again, and you see this in the lead up to World War One, where the British are traveling around Europe and they are making security guarantees. They are fomenting alliances, particularly to corner in the Germans, because once again, going back to Salisbury, Germans need to fall before the Russians can. They're the smaller target.
yes,
They're the easier one to take out. But
yep,
a lot of that does involve pitting the Germans and the Russians against each other. So if they can make an alliance of convenience with the Russians against the Germans, uh, well, you see, the Bolshevik Revolution was actually their ideal scenario, where the Germans were beat back, the Russian Empire completely collapsed in on itself. And look, you want the truth behind anti-communism, and yes, principally, I do not like communism. I think it's a failure of a system. I think we've seen it play out terribly in many circumstances, but I think we can also be nuanced about history and look at the realities of the Soviet Union in particular. But one of the main reasons they despised the Soviet Union was not because they hated communism. In fact, they had no problem supporting communists all across the world. It's
that's right.
because they managed to, Stalin in particular, and his successors to a degree, managed to rebuild the Russian Empire, as it were. Maybe not entirely. And look, I understand a lot of the ethnic issues in the Soviet Union, that a lot of ethnic Russians were sidelined in favor of Ukrainians, Georgians, etc. But they were able to rebuild that power block, so to speak,
Yep.
and direct it against Anglosphere interests. And that's a large part behind quote unquote anti communism. It was never really anti communism. They just viewed the Soviet Union as a Red Russian Empire, and that's the reason they hated it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, so I just find that timeline hilarious. How Stalin just because he knew, I think, when he was doing the purges of a certain group who have their own country now in the Middle East. Um, when he was doing that, that is when they turned on him, right? But they needed him for World War II, and remember, there were still plans, like, to go after the Soviet Union after the defeat of the Germans, right? But they weren't willing to. Anyhow, I just found that I found
No,
that
no,
whole timeline very interesting.
it was a bit of an aside, but I do think it enriches the conversation particularly regarding the U.S. and Russia, regarding Anglosphere-Russia relations in general, and why, I mean, frankly, Ukraine is just a continuation of this, of trying to drive a wedge between particularly Russia and continental Europe, because I would say ever since at least the 19th century, if not going back further, this is uh, the global alignment that they wanted to prevent. And now, look, going back to the World War One stuff, I know there were other extenuating factors. I know the Russians had an established relationship with the French that played into that, and also had their eyes in the Balkans, which puts them at odds with the Austrians. There's a lot of different factors, and I'm not downplaying those. But I'm talking about a certain strategy, particularly of the British Empire, that they want to carry out in Europe, and the elements of that, while also once again taking into consideration everything else, but focusing mainly on what we had just discussed with that British strategy, particularly through Salisbury and going back through that. But
Now I could be wrong, but I think it was Tsar Nicholas the First who had that. People can correct me in the chat because it's been a few years since I've read on this. But in the 1840s, there were some potential revolutions. I think it was Tsar Nicholas the First. They made kind of a league of conservative monarchs
uh,
to stop any potential
that
revolutions from occurring, including one in Austria.
yes, that was the Triple Alliance that was actually formed after the Congress of Vienna with
Yes,
Alexander the First. Now, I think
Alexander. Yes,
at the time when it was actually implemented, that where the Russians did help put down the 1848 revolts, that was under Nicholas the First, I believe.
yes, yes, yes. And so some people have theorized that it was in Britain's interest at that time, and another little group, that they all become Republicans, that they shed that exterior of the monarch and the church, right?
Yes, they despise throne and altar. That's what they wanted to
Throne and
destroy
altar,
in Europe.
yes, yes, that's exactly the term I'm looking for. Britain could have it, plus a parliament. I mean, they've had a parliament for a long time. That is part of their tradition. But everyone else could, they could not have it, and certainly not these guys. They had to adopt republicanism and essentially liberalism in the 19th century. That's what it was. And when the Russians stopped that, I think that infuriated a lot of elites on the British Isles. Not all of them necessarily British, but a lot of them, yes. Because a lot of these things could not have happened without these two groups working together. And I know that will piss a lot of people off, but that is the truth. And you still see it today. It still exists today. People nearly 200 years later still like Ukraine is a textbook example of like all the all the people who run Ukraine are the very people that the E-right has been against. But then the war starts, all poor Ukraine. Uh, anyways,
No, I'm glad you brought all that up, because I do think, while it was a bit of an aside, it still is important context, and this is something we've wanted to talk about for a while. So I'm glad we just tore off that band-aid and
yeah,
got out of the way. I certainly do want to talk more about the subject. We might need a dedicated episode to it.
yeah, yeah,
But getting back to more contemporary issues, with all that having been said, once again, you do see this. That is the angle of a significant amount of the American foreign policy establishment. The Americans as sort of the inheritors of the British Empire, if you will, down to much of the structure of it post World War II. That's what they want to do in Ukraine. That was the goal from the outset, was to use it to, in my opinion, fracture Russia from Europe, with the secondary effect of hopefully causing internal collapse within Russia. And now you have Trump, who comes in there, who doesn't really have the historical base for any of this. It's not like he's well read in, say, Mackinder, or like any sort of European history or foreign policy. And he thinks he can good cop, bad cop.
yeah.
What, 3-4 centuries of this? It's just simply not going to work. And while it is my sincerest desire that there is a lasting peace that isn't just kicking the can 10 years down the road and inflaming the situation and making it worse, I simply don't see that happening. And I will return to the issue of the European elites. Look, if these people really want to show that they have strategic autonomy, if they really want to show how independent they are from Donald Trump in the United
Yeah.
States, call Putin. Call him up, talk about real peace terms. Do what, I can't believe I'm saying this, do what Merkel did.
Yeah, yeah. Like
I
at
think
least
about
be at least be willing to lay down your life. At least as a leader of your country, at least be willing to say, I may get killed, by a CIA or a Mossad agent or MI6 agent. But God damn it, we're not doing this. We're not doing this again. Europe is not going to go through another horrific war. Um, I mean, just look at how ill prepared Russia
Oh,
was for this war.
yes.
Like, to decide to invade during the muddy season, really, at the end of February, like, give me a break, right? With a force somewhere around 150,000 and a little more if you include the people in Donbass, who aren't really part of the Russian military, but are capable anyways. So anyhow, yeah, like, yeah. So Trump. I mean, that whole. I love watching some of the other programs. Like the, the Duran has gone nuts, especially Alexander Mercurius. He's gone crazy. Like he must. I'm sorry, but he has like the biggest bluff. I won't even mention it. He thinks Trump is like on the level. I mean, not that I cared for either Roosevelt. Don't misunderstand me. I don't care. Okay, I don't care either way. But he thinks that Trump is making the big kind of changes to America that Roosevelt was doing, prior to and during World War II, right? Like it's so crazy that he actually thinks this. He's saying this on the day of the inauguration, even before the inauguration, when Trump was in St. John's Church in Washington, right? And there's just something so crazy about that. Why would he like? I don't know. It's
I do think.
I think there are people who are not really reading this very well. I don't know if they're signaling something else. Like if the guys in the Duran are funded by Moscow, then like that does not bode. This does not bode well for Russia. Then they have some kind of insider knowledge. If they are like basically a Western plant, right, and they've never been banned and whatnot, then really they're leading you astray. But remember, they could also just be human. You and I laughed about like Russia invading. We didn't think Russia would invade. And they didn't either. But Russia did, and I didn't because I thought like, why would they, and why would they do it now? Like, but the Ukrainians began shelling Donbass, and Zelensky went to that summit in Germany and said he's going to get nuclear weapons, and then I started to worry. But in January of 2022, I didn't think
No, it didn't
they
look
would.
likely. Now, to our credit, we said that out of all the scares, this is most likely to actually fester into war. Uh,
Yeah.
and even though I didn't expect it, I don't think a lot of people did. But what I will say is, I think after the Biden era of such naked incompetence and decline, not saying it didn't exist before, that a lot of people are willing to pick up on the first optimistic signs that they see and run with them. And as you said, sometimes that's just human instinct to look at these things and to start running with them. And you can get yourself, and we've done it on this show certainly, you can walk yourself down pretty bizarre paths, pretty bizarre theories if you just follow one line of thought to its conclusion. And where it doesn't resemble reality at all. And
Yeah.
I try to avoid that. Of course, we're not infallible when it comes to that kind of stuff. But that is one thing. Temper your expectations for everything you hear.
Hmm.
And with the Ukraine war, once again, I think what we're going to see is that this is going to continue on. At a certain point, I think Trump is going to throw up his hands and just walk away from the table. And I do think that there will be some saving of face at a certain point where uh, they make it look like we did everything we could for Ukraine, but still fell. But returning back to the Russian side, what I was going to say earlier is that while Putin is willing to fight this, well, I do believe at least Putin, or at least the people around him, or at least there's enough pressure on him, are willing to fight this war as long as they have to. If they have to drive all the way to the Dnieper, they will. For the sake of international law, which, I mean, Putin at least still tries to make some attempt, public appearances about international law where, look, Russia does things the right way. And he could probably cite you all these UN and treaty articles as to why the action he took in Ukraine was actually in line with international law. And look, it may or may not be. I don't really think it's relevant at this point. But just for the sake of appearance, for the sake of saving face, and for the sake of appealing to these unaligned nations in places like maybe Africa and some parts of East Asia and some parts of Latin America, I think it does play well to an extent. So
Mhm.
ultimately, I think um, biggest, the, the greatest avenue that you would have for something like this, if you were to actually get a proper U.S. Russia summit or a multinational summit in order to solve this Ukraine issue, is that ultimately I think Putin wants a negotiated peace for the sake of appearances. I think he wants to uphold some norms of international law so he can point to this. And once again, we know he's a lawyer, we know his background, where he does want to be able to point to these treaties, point to these articles, and that ultimately, from his calculation, from the calculation of him, his foreign policy team, whatever, it looks good if there's a brokered peace treaty versus imposed terms on Ukraine. Even though imposed terms on Ukraine would probably benefit Russia more in the long term, I do think that Putin, for consideration of the very volatile state of the world, the global order, might actually prefer that option. Which I'm not saying that it would be a loss for Russia, but I'm saying that they're not going to get everything they want if they want to maintain these public appearances. And like I said, I could be wrong about all of this, but knowing Putin, knowing his instincts at this point, I do think that he would want something that resembles a multilateral peace treaty that guarantees the neutrality of what's left of Ukraine, et cetera, all the points he keeps bringing up, rather than marching up to the outskirts of Kiev, taking everything up to the Dnieper, and imposing terms. Because uh, I, at least I think he believes that that could be used against Russia at some point in the future, used to paint it as a much more aggressive country than he would want it to be seen as, and also, once again, for some global appearance of international law, where he wants to be able to make his case to these so-called global South countries that, look, I do things the proper way. We had to fight this military operation, but look, I did it the proper way. It wasn't like Iraq where we just went in and toppled the government and did whatever.
Mhm. Now, I will say one kind of glimmer of hope was today there was news that the U.S. has withdrawn all applications for the transit of goods in interest of Ukraine through Rzeszów, spelled Rzeszów.
I'm assuming that's in Poland.
It's in Poland.
Of course it
Actually,
is.
I knew a girl from there, and it's spelled Rzeszów. Rzeszów. Rzeszów, Konstanta, and Varna. Varna is in Bulgaria. Now, on top of that, okay, that in itself is very interesting. All shipments of weapons and military equipment to Ukraine have been stopped at NATO bases in Europe. According to preliminary estimates, we are talking about several thousands of tons of weapons and military equipment. All Pentagon employees involved in arms supplies to Kiev have been fired or suspended. A large scale audit of the misuse of funds to aid to Ukraine has begun. Interesting.
That's the most substantial thing I've heard about peace towards Ukraine, frankly.
Yeah.
And honestly, if the Trump administration, which time will tell, I don't want to go too much either way on Trump because of what a volatile figure he is, and I know I keep using that word over and over. Forgive me for being repetitive. And number two, just the sake of the global state, and like I said, with how soon it is, the sake of the global state, with how unpredictable of a figure Trump is, I don't want to be too pro or too anti-Trump at this point, at least. Between that and frankly, I think if the West were to adopt a blanket asylum policy for Ukrainians, and I do realize the issue is that, and I do realize I might sound somewhat hypocritical, but frankly, if the West were willing to accept asylum applications from any Ukrainian who isn't just an outright like Bandera worshiper, that's the end of the Ukrainian war effort. You get the people out, you stop the weapon flow, it's over. That's the way you end the
Yeah.
war in Ukraine realistically.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. There could be more than one layer to Trump's words. Of course, Trump is loath to hear that Putin got him elected. The whole fake Putin Trump scandal, of 2016, all that nonsense.
all those lies literally created by a front company that Hillary Clinton herself made with a former MI6 agent, Christopher Steele, the whole Steele dossier nonsense. Um, but also to just, because I think this is a point where we can talk a little bit about the domestic stuff, but not necessarily the domestic stuff about Russia, but about a sphere of influence of America in context to what is happening in Russia and Europe,
Okay, so
right?
you actually want to get into the meat of his inauguration, like the speech, the ceremony, all of that. Then
No.
okay.
What I was going to say, because you've brought up Fortress America, right? Why does Trump want to buy Greenland or take over Canada or the Panama Canal and so on and so forth, right? And we were discussing on the last few shows that this could be more of a question of contraction than a question of expansion. Of course, for the Americans, right, he knows how to give them red meat. Like all the ails and woes of the last, I don't know, 4 years, all of it can disappear as soon as they find out they might buy Greenland.
Or
As
change
if
the name of the Gulf of Mexico,
it's the Gulf of
which I just want
it
to put
doesn't
out.
speak very highly. It does not speak very highly of the American people.
I
But
just want to put out there my compromise first, just one aside for the Gulf of Mexico situation. I say we cut all our losses and call it the Gulf of New Spain.
the Gulf of New Spain. Is that based? I don't know. So here's the thing. If we accept that America wanted this war in Europe to make sure that Europe is not a rival, right? To destroy Europe. Remember, Kamala Collis gave a speech today. I guess she's taken over Ursula von der Leyen's position, has
I
she
thought she
not?
took Borrell's position.
Burrell's. You're right. And she gave a speech like, well, yeah, we have to build up our military for protecting the priests, but we should be prepared for a war by 2029. Like, okay, so if we accept that the Americans always wanted to do this to the Europeans, that they resented any kind of cooperation with Russia, because that would, I don't know, put America as number one only in the Western Hemisphere, but not all over the planet. Like, you know, I don't know. You have to cry about that, I guess. But um, if you have to accept that, right? If you accept that, they're going to destroy Europe in this one way or another, whether it's a war, economy, or both, and destroying the Nord Stream was part of it, then let's say America goes into a contraction, right? You want Europe and Russia at each other's throats for a long time. Now you can focus on other issues. We know the Trump administration wants to focus on China, but let's say you're contracting, you're consolidating what you already own. Remember that the Americans after World War II told the Canadians, you have to demilitarize, right? So the Canadians demilitarized when they were working on the Avro Arrow. They had to scrap that. And then later, the flag, I don't like that Union Jack. So, the so-called gay Canadian flag, well, that's because of American prejudice, right? Like, I said, I didn't get into this when Gio was on the show, but like, again, please temper your, like, maybe you live in a red state, but maybe you're not seeing the bigger picture, and maybe you don't know history that well. So anyways, I mean, this is just like with the Alaskan Panhandle, where the Americans wanted to take as many islands to stop the British from like going across the Pacific, except this was technically Canada now, not Britain. And so basically the British sided with the Americans and gave America the Panhandle. Like, it was just this betrayal of. So anyways, so I guess what I'm saying is Canada's never been sovereign, so like, everybody chill out. And Britain has already made the decision to be America's lapdog, and Canada has to follow. They're not going to stop, like, giving important I don't know, minerals or other commodities to the Americans, the natural
I'll have you
resources.
know the resist liberals told me that Canada was the last hope against Donald Trump's fascism.
Oh yeah. But speaking of Trudeau, he did say something. He did say something today was probably the only truthful thing he's ever said in his entire prime ministership, and that is, he said, if Trump wants to bring this new golden era of America, right, he's going to need a lot of resources, right? And Greenland, and particularly Canada, has a lot of those resources, right? Like, as if, now this is hilarious, because as if Americans haven't been buying those resources for ages and ages.
I mean, to my understanding, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. In terms of mining right contracts, American companies have dominated those in Canada for a number of decades now, where we've
Decades and decades,
had
right?
almost
Like,
exclusive mining rights to Ukrainian. What's the difference between Ukraine and Canada at this point?
yeah, yeah,
What, largest
exactly.
Ukrainian diaspora in the world? Yeah, it's all the same to
Yeah.
me. But with all that being said, Canadian mineral rights, and also I know that things got stymied with it, but you also had the Keystone Pipeline. An immense amount of cooperation between these countries. Probably the two most integrated economies in the world.
Okay, so now we get an idea of GDP to purchasing power, right? And that China's pulled already ahead. They already surpassed the US and the EU in 2017. Okay, so that's, yeah, 8 years ago.
Okay, I got the chart back up.
Okay, so let's say we're looking at that, right? You want to keep, you want a way for the Americans to, to stay on top somehow, right? But Trump has, what has he been doing? He's been threatening that if you leave the American dollar, we're going to sanction. He's going to sanction everybody. Remember, he's going to, as he said, he's going to sanction Russia. Blah blah blah. But let's say that the plan underneath this is that for reindustrialization, it's not just a question of bankrupting Europe and forcing them to move either to America or China, which they have, but to set up manufacturing here, because 45% of everything that's manufactured on the planet is manufactured in China. So you've got over 200 countries, and the other 55% has to be divvied up amongst 200 countries, but this one country has 45%. So if he wants to manufacture, right, what he will probably have to do is set up manufacturing in a place where it's cheap to manufacture and a strong American dollar can buy from them. So Canada becomes like a resource hub along with, let's say, Greenland, right? And Mexico becomes a manufacturing hub.
Yes, which also goes
That
back
that's the
to
way like Fortress America would work.
yes, and you did see that Trump did designate the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, which gives license to the U.S., depending on how the circumstances work out, to get further entrenched into Mexico. And yeah, you can objectively argue that yes, these cartels are among some of the most depraved organizations in the world. I agree. But once again, what's the implications of declaring these organizations as terrorists? It gives the U.S. license to dig itself further into Mexico and get itself further entrenched into yet another foreign theater. Sure, it might be on our border, but once again, we've seen the disaster of interventions halfway across the world. What do you think an intervention on a border would look like? I can't even imagine what the American Southwest would look like in the wake of any sort of substantial American intervention in Mexico, even though, once again, that's a little bit down the road. But when it does put, number one, pressure on Mexico. Number two, it gives the U.S. Further license to intervene. Number three, if they want to establish a manufacturing base, they also need to secure some sort of safety and political stability there. So even if they just want to carve out zones in which Mexico has industrial zones, say somewhere along the border, just you know anywhere really, then yes, it all does play into that, and you are seeing that with Fortress America, and we could even talk about some of the Latin American issues, but I'll hold off for that for now, and I'll get into Panama in just a moment here.
Yeah.
But it is a contraction because the Europeans are kneecapped. They're not going to reconcile with Russia, even though the U.S. is going to divert attention. Whatever attention it gives to Europe will be pressure not to reconcile with the Russians. We're going to set our sights probably on the Asia Pacific, while also having the obligatory focus in the Middle East, which I will talk about Trump's Middle Eastern policy, the relationship with Netanyahu, and the tentative Gaza ceasefire, because I think there's a few interesting elements in there. But point being is, it does allow the Americans to reorient themselves for that real pivot to Asia that they've wanted for a number of years, which brings us back to the Panama Canal. Now, this was the one territorial acquisition that's been floated that Trump actually did mention in his inauguration speech, talking about wanting to regain control of the Panama Canal and driving out the dreaded Chinese, who apparently just control the canal now, despite the fact that 2/3 of American ships go through there. And
Yeah.
and with that, it does turn out that yes, a number of Venezuelan ships heading to the Asia Pacific do pass through the Panama Canal. That does make up a significant amount of trade through there. Which, when it comes to oil, yes, they would want to control the energy supply. They'd want to be able to have more direct control over the canal. And with that, it does create Fortress North America because it would stymie. And look, I don't think that China controls the canal, but they certainly use it. It would stymie that. It would force them to maybe reinvest in somewhere like Nicaragua in order to secure that those trade routes in Latin America. And even if they would want to try to say build a Nicaraguan canal, which I know was a proposal a few years back, you could have U.S. sanctions, and there's a number of tools the U.S. would deploy in order to prevent that project from going through. But it does fortify America in that sense, where our power projection within our own hemisphere is unlike anything we've ever seen before. If we have all of those elements, even if these aren't official annexations, even if there is a ceding of the canal zone, Greenland is even if Greenland becomes independent. I know that talks of Greenland independence have picked up ever since the conversation where the Danes are hemming and hawing about a referendum, saying, "Oh, well, the Greenland people, they can have a referendum whenever they want." Well, an independent Greenland would be, even if the U.S. didn't outright annex it, it would remove the Europeans from the equation. It would be a much more direct relationship between the United States and newly independent Greenland. Canada, once again, we talked about that. The U.S. is going to be able to pretty much impose any terms on it, especially with an incoming conservative government. Uh, it's just going to be complete Ottawa, Washington integration in all but name. And then we also, and having considered what I just said about Mexico, North America is fortified. It's more impenetrable than ever. And then, returning to some of Trump's previous comments, he said he wanted to build a quote unquote Iron Dome for the United States. He wants to increase missile defenses. So that plays into that, wanting to build North America into a fortress, which I would say necessarily does pull away from different theaters, particularly the Europeans. But once again, we always had that pressure on the Europeans in order to do our bidding, especially if we become their main energy supplier, then we're going to be the one with all the cards. And the Europeans, paying a premium for American energy, are not going to be able to reestablish themselves so long as they continue to insist to feud with Russia on behalf of the American State Department. Look, I know that, yes, this is primarily an American drive for the Europeans and the Russians to be divided, but let's not pretend like there's not plenty of willing collaborators in Europe who we've certainly talked about to a great extent, and that American pressure would still be at an all-time high, even if we directly divested from Europe, for the Europeans to stay the course. But with all that, once again, you're now primed for a pivot to Asia, where Trump, although he's been saying conciliatory things about Xi Jinping and even the Chinese to an extent, it creates the avenues for pressures there. And at a certain point, who knows? You might get a push for maybe the remilitarization of Japan, maybe to hand something over, because they can also look like America is becoming less involved in global affairs if we lean on the Japanese saying it's time for you to remilitarize and take up a greater role in the region. Even though I do debate how much the Americans would want another militarized Japan. I think at this point it would serve American foreign policy interests, and at worst, it would be a situation like Turkey was, say, maybe 10 years ago, where they are, they do waffle a bit, but ultimately fall on the side of the U.S. And like I said, that's Turkey about 10, 15 years ago. But I do think, looking at that, he does have his sights set on China. He wants to table the Russia issue, even table the Middle Eastern issue, much to the chagrin of Netanyahu and maybe some of his more hardline Zionist backers, and wants to focus on China because, once again, I still have the GDP graph up here and the purchasing power graph up here. Uh, China's economic rise is still uh, unscathed from all of this. They came out of COVID way better than we did. They came out of all these crises of the recent years, has not managed to stop their level of economic progress and their level of rising global influence. So I do think that with all that considered, this isn't a unique take, but Trump does want to tighten the screws on the Asia Pacific, and we could see that, I don't know, maybe via pressure on the Korean issue again, perhaps on the Taiwan issue. There's a number of vectors which the U.S. can use to further entrench itself in Asia, increase pressure on China, but that does necessarily come at the cost of at least tabling, at least putting on the back burner the Russian and the Middle Eastern issue.
Hmm.
But with all that being said, I suppose we should talk about this tentative Gaza ceasefire.
Yeah, which I mean, Netanyahu's already talking about, can I keep some parts of southern Lebanon? And I guess one of the things I wanted to mention, we were saying who's really running who? Is it Israel? Is it America? I guess America still runs Israel, but a lot of the same people who run both, they have interest in both. So
Yes, they see them as one and the same, and
yeah,
there's a lot of, let's say, more transnational types in America who are frustrated with the more ultra Zionist and ultra nationalistic elements of Israel when it creates friction with the American empire. And of course, they'll back it to the hilt, but there's a lot of people within the American empire of particular ethnic and maybe even religious persuasion who do view it as an inconvenience many times, especially when you do have someone like Netanyahu with Ben Gvir and Smotrich in his ear, because they lose sight of the greater picture. I'll put it that way in
yeah,
for regional interests.
yes.
But
I
what
mean, like how long? I mean, I get it. I get why it happened. I get why it worked out for Trump. Netanyahu, the idiot in 2020, was one of the first to congratulate Biden, which was obviously a rigged election. It had to be on some level. Okay, I'm sorry. Like,
it's
w-
okay.
w-
I think we should be. I think pretty much everyone submitted at this point. But of course, if YouTube asked, we're just kidding.
we're
But
kidding. We're kidding. We're kidding. YouTube. This is a very humorous show. Have you not heard
it's a
how much
comedy
laughing
program.
takes place? It is a comedy program. It's the funniest geopolitical channel you're ever going to listen to. But but I mean, Netanyahu, I thought like he completely betrayed him, and he did admit that that he owed Trump a favor. He owed Trump a favor. I mean, Trump saved Al Qaeda and he killed Soleimani. I mean, that's a big deal for the Israelis. So, uh, two very important interest groups, let's say, or groups of interest for the Israelis and for the Americans. But in any case, um, he did it for the inauguration, right? Because Trump said from the beginning that he is going to be this unifying president and a kind of a peace president. I mean, every American president has claimed that they're going to bring peace, right? They don't, because I don't think there's been only a 5-year gap where America hasn't been at war. So don't hold your breath. Trump may not even be able to do what he did last time, which was not create a new war. Instead, he just funded all the other wars that were started. These things have a kind of a momentum all their own, and also there's a kind of a mindset, like earlier I was talking about how elated Americans were that the Gulf of Mexico was going to be called the Gulf of America, and they were going to acquire Greenland, right? There's always this kind of pirate quality to the American mindset, like, I don't know, it's stupid shit, like let's say Syria. We were talking off air, right? This got my blood boiling. So one of the guys, I know I'm slightly deviating, maybe not slightly, but I am deviating a little bit. Um, Abu Ahmed has been appointed as the new advisor to Giuliani and his Free Syria regime. Okay, I'm just gonna send you an image of this piece of shit.
Oh, this wonderful specimen.
I am not gonna send you the really horrible stuff. Okay,
Uh,
I'm
well,
not gonna send you that.
yeah. There's only so much I can. I mean, this
Yeah.
obviously is fine, but there's only so much I can put on here. Uh, so I'll go ahead and get this up right here.
Remember the Dust Boy, this thing, which he later admitted was faked. Okay. Okay. I don't know if this was I don't know if this was his son or not, right?
Yeah,
But
I'll
he
get
was
the picture for comparison. Oh yeah, the big psyop.
yes. Okay. So this is also the same piece of shit who cut the head off of a Palestinian boy refugee living in Syria. The boy begged him to shoot him instead of sawing through his neck with a knife. And this piece of shit, who's also a dad, did this to another child, right? And this is what I mean. Like it infuriates me because when I've said this before, but when 9/11 happened, like I was very affected. I remember crying, right? I remember seeing people jumping off, and I couldn't believe it. I made posters. I tried to, like, my brother helped me, friends helped me. We spread pamphlets and we did all kinds of things for years because we really believed like if people knew more of like the deeper story behind it, let's say that something horrible. Because my feeling was that if the lies persisted, right, then future cooperation between the US, Israel, and Al Qaeda would continue. And that is exactly what's happened, right? And it's just that I don't know, a lot of Americans that's the impression I get in social media. They're very lackadaisical. They've completely forgotten about. Yeah, and so back then I was afraid that they were going to start working again together. That is, let's say Al Qaeda, Israel, America, and this would all be for nothing, you know. Me and my friends, we did this at considerable risk, and anyways, so I don't know how to gauge things from just social media, but to me, Constantine, a lot of them are very lackadaisical about this. I think that's horrendous. Like we beat Assad. Why? Because my government said we beat Assad, right? Like, I mean, he didn't attack you, dummy. Like literally the people who helped kill 3,000 of your own, right? Like that's who did this. So anyways, a piece. So I want to put this into a larger context because the other thing that the Israelis did is they attacked HTS for the first time. They hit a column. I don't know how sophisticated this column was. I don't know how many armored vehicles, blah blah blah, but they hit an HTS column. I don't have any reports on how many dead and injured, but they hit a column, and that's never happened before. So I find that interesting. And as I said, um, there is fighting right now in the West Bank. Like it's just Gaza that there's a ceasefire. Like there's fighting between Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank. Like it, you know. But for the camera, like for Trump's inauguration, he can sell that. I think for Trump, it's very important that he comes across as the president of peace. However, let's say that there's another false flag, like another October 7th that happens. You think Trump is going to hold back? No. What do you think? This will be the point where all the MAGA peds will literally become like the GOP. They've resisted up until now, right? They've resisted up until now. Generally, they've been pretty good. They haven't been like there's a segment of them that are they're just GOP cutouts and unintentionally, but to a degree. But they've sort of resisted going all the way, and I think it's not over. I don't think why did the Israelis stop? Was it just for his inauguration? Were they not a little overextended?
I,
Like
I have my thoughts on this, but I do want to add to one of your points. I will
mm,
say to everyone listening, and I think our audience probably understands this, but for any passerbys who might listen to this, this might be the only war report you ever listen to. I want you to walk away with this. You owe Donald Trump nothing. He owes you everything. Okay? Never get that twisted.
yes, that's perfect. That's so succinct. I love it. Yep, that's right. You owe him nothing. And I would say that I mean, is Iran still on the table? Because I think now, like especially if the Russians say no to a blunt peace deal, They're going to go after Iran. I think that might be a bigger catalyst for going after Iran than, because Iran is signaling all kinds of peace stuff. They even sent over aid to LA, right? Where there are probably a lot of Jewish Iranians that live there and so on, right? So I don't know. I
Uh,
don't know.
but I did want to. I'll return to the Iran point because I do have a couple things I want to bring up on that. But I do want to talk about Netanyahu and particularly his future. So when I first heard this deal and the fact that Trump's negotiators more or less forced the Israelis
Yes.
into this, is that when peace breaks out, if peace is able to maintain for a long enough term, things will return in Israel to what they were pre-October 7th, 2023, where Netanyahu will be on the ropes because of his corruption charges, because of his attempts to consolidate power,
Hmm. Hmm.
and that he is probably likely on the way out of power. They're going to want to try to put him in jail, but he'll have ways around that, whether it's allies within Israel or, I don't know, maybe a nice penthouse in Mar-a-Lago. Who knows? But with that being said, I do think there was some coordination, and we'll see if this plays out. But I do think it's likely there was some coordination between Trump's team and maybe one of the opposition factions in Israel, or maybe multiple opposition factions in Israel, where Trump can bring home a ceasefire. He can talk about how he's the candidate of peace. I mentioned in his inauguration speech, mentioned in his first days in office, and talk about how the hostages were returned thanks to the strength of Donald Trump, and look, he wasn't even in office when we got this. While at the same time, the Israelis finally get to be rid of Netanyahu, who Trump, once again, has a very contentious relationship with. You get a new face in there. I don't know, maybe it's Bennett, maybe it's Lapid, maybe it's any of these other big opposition figures.
And Ben Gvir quit.
Yeah,
He
Ben.
resigned.
Yeah, he.
There was another Israeli in Netanyahu's cabinet that resigned just today. I would never heard of his name before, but this is the
Was that
second.
the one of the IDF officers that?
Yes, he was.
I'll,
Yes, he
here,
was.
I know you sent that to me. I'll look it up.
Yes, yes. Yeah,
Because
you're exactly right.
I want to get that exactly. Um, I'll look for that. If you have any thoughts while I look
You
for
you
that.
keep going. You keep going. I'm looking for it.
Okay. But what my ultimate thought. Oh, here we are. Yarav Finkelman, commander of
Wow.
the Southern Command in the Israeli Army, also announced his resignation due to the failure of October 7th. Finkelman's reasoning for resignation, and I quote, "On October 7th, we failed in defending the Western Negev and its beloved and heroic residents." So he stood down for what he says is his failure to fulfill his role in a military capacity. But I do think, given everything, that they are doing a cleaning of house in Israel, and that they do want Netanyahu gone, and Trump would be more than happy to, I don't know, shake hands with whoever Netanyahu's replacement is, if they can hold another election, whatever it is, whether the Likud manages to form a new coalition without it being taken to an election, whatever. Trump can still be the pro-Israel guy. He can still show that to his Zionist backers and say, we did it, guys. Israel is at peace, and Iran isn't going to threaten them anymore. Assad's gone, Hezbollah's cut off, blah, 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 blah. And like I said, you also get the issue of Netanyahu, who is on very bad terms with Trump, out of the way. Even if Trump does give him the Mar-a-Lago penthouse in order to just get him the retirement, he's out of the way. He's out of the question. But for the issue of Iran, I do think if, as you said, Trump fails to secure the Ukraine deal, he doubles down in the Middle East because he does need the show of strength. And
Hmm.
I do think that the Iranians will continue the course to pursue the bomb because at that point they just have no other choice. They have no other deterrent. And uh, we made our own bet on that. There's a reason North Korea is still standing and Gaddafi met the end that he did.
Yes.
And that is because Gaddafi disarmed, Kim did not. And Kim was not willing to disarm. That was where the Korean peace talks failed. And that I think the Iranians are going to learn this lesson, which is why they've signed these security agreements with Russia. Not outright alliance, but they've made security agreements with Russia, and to the Chinese to the lesser extent, where they are hedging all their bets. They are building up a defensive network in order to deter any sort of U.S. and I would say to a lesser extent Israeli action, direct action against the Iranians. Although, what I will say is that Iran's internal instability does lend itself to a
Yeah.
soft regime change. It does lend itself to a color revolution. We did discuss that previously. And I do think uh, who would one of the primary factions in that is Pezeshkian. The fact that he won in the first place, and the fact that I think he is the kind of leader who would acquiesce to a color revolution if it did show up on his streets, and that he would be the one who was trying to. He would do what Yanukovych did. He would be too conciliatory to the opposition and eventually his own undoing. But with that being said, do you think Pezeshkian can remain in power in general, whether it's a more hardliner that replaces him or whether it is a color revolution that replaces him? I simply don't
No.
see in the world of Trump, and I know that Biden, of course, had an aggressive Middle Eastern policy, but I don't see in the world of Trump where it's much more overt that somebody like Pezeshkian can survive politically.
Yeah, I'm with you. Now, like, um, Pezeshkian, to me, is some kind of a internal Iranian strategy, basically to signal to the West and the Israelis that they don't want a wider war. That's what that means to me. Now, we'll never know if who exactly killed the previous
Raisi.
Raisi president. But, I mean, and this guy is, I think, half Kurdish, anyways,
Yeah,
right?
he's Kurdish, Azeri, and some other
Yeah,
the typical ethnic mix that you expect from somebody from like rural Iran.
right. But he's Shia, and I guess that's the continuity, and so on and so on. Um, but also he's more closely aligned with the Ayatollah than the previous guy. There were some arguments placed that Raisi had, let's say, more differences with the Ayatollah, or in terms of like Raisi's children or grandchildren could inherit certain roles that, again, it could have been internal. There could have been internal struggles for hegemony based on different groups of elites fighting it out amongst themselves, or it could have been I don't know, the Israelis or the Americans, or it could have been a combination of the both. But the bottom line, the bottom effect that I see happening is Peshkian is like basically saying, "Look, we're not going to, we don't want to fight you." Now, that has its just strategic and tactical importance, because if the Israelis do want to fight Iran, or they want the Americans to go fight Iran, um, the public has to know that it's not what the regime wanted, right? And if people are being like, yes, the Iranians were helping Hezbollah, but Hezbollah, what was Hezbollah doing to Israel before October the 7th? I mean, nothing. They were just there. They weren't attacking villages.
Hezbollah for the past 15 years, 14 years, the main reason they made headlines was fighting in the Syrian civil war. And look, I'm not
Yeah,
saying you gotta like these guys, but I think everyone can agree they were preferable to Al Qaeda and ISIS. Oh, maybe not everyone,
right.
but I think anyone sane can agree to that.
Anyone sane can agree to this. As I said, Al Qaeda is very important to Israel and to America. They really, really love these guys. Anything can be forgiven. Um, and in many ways, on a subconscious level, a lot of Americans just go along with this. Uh, so I would say that, you know, like I say, if the pretext for a war is well done, Trump will go and his base will support him all the way. And if even if he only acquires rights to mine in Greenland, and he makes a joke about it, or
Or even if
you know,
Greenland has an independence referendum that votes in favor.
yes, yes, even if I mean, everything will be forgiven. Everything will be forgiven. If
if the amount of people crossing over from the Mexican border is reduced by, I don't know, 20%, 25% less than under Biden, he'll probably be forgiven. Like, like the GOP got Trump in the GOP. Trump didn't change Rubio's mind. He didn't change Netanyahu's mind. He didn't change any of these people's
He
minds.
changed their rhetoric.
Yes, very good, right? So now the whole point is to incorporate the MAGA movement into the GOP, right? Which is a kind of 90s liberalism, right? It's kind of the liberalism everybody remembers. It's less, none of that woke stuff that Obama introduced, right? We can make it work if everybody just stops being racist. You white guys, you better stop being racist.
Yeah,
I'm gonna.
we can all be civic nationalists, and don't
That's
worry,
right.
we'll stop the greater excesses of the LGBTQ CIA, but we're still going to have legal marriage for them, of course.
Yes,
We will affirm the principle while reining in the excesses. Is really what they're proposing for a lot of these things.
and this is why, even though it wasn't true, this is why in the alt-right 1.0 they were accused of being Russian agents. Why? Because they were right wingers who were not aligned with Jewish interests. Ergo, they must be Russian. Because all of Europe is also aligned with Jewish interests, just like America. And that's why they got that label. It isn't because Putin, funded fascination or or the Daily Show. you know,
Look, it's all a network that goes back to Moscow. We've all seen all the political cartoons of the Russian
Dugan the puppet
octopus.
master.
Yeah, Dugin, who most Russians probably couldn't even told you who he was before the war broke out. That's the guy controlling everything.
Yeah, of
Dugin, the
course,
guy who
has to
got
be.
fired from his job at Moscow University under Putin, that's the guy controlling everything. He's the
Yeah, and
mastermind.
Putin made sure he left.
Yeah,
It was Putin who basically got him fired.
yeah. And Dugin, who went on record as being very critical of Putin a number of times, he's the puppet master.
Yes.
It is just this Western obsession. They want another Rasputin, and they didn't understand the original, and they want to recreate something that they fundamentally never understood in the first place. The dark puppet
That-
master of whoever's in power in Russia. They love that. They love mythologizing this stuff. They love degrading it to the most base
Yes.
level, not base level
Yeah.
that they can, because they know that the masses are going to eat this up. And I will spare you guys the rant about mass literacy and why it might be a mistake mistake for now. But I do think it plays into that the public, or I don't know, maybe the problem is the public isn't literate enough. It's one of the two. They're either too literate or not literate enough, or maybe we're stuck in this the worst of both worlds. Or we either need to educate them more, educate them less. That might be the case. We just need to pick a path. But with that being said, it does get down to everything you said was correct fundamentally.
Yeah.
That they are trying to capture the space. They're trying to capture this, and the comparison is cheap. It's made common, but it does remind me a lot of how the left wing managed to scoop up a lot of the distant energy of the 1960s from, say, the Vietnam protests. Now, look, I know
Right.
there are a lot of elements that went into that. Don't get me wrong,
Mhm.
but whatever genuine anti-establishment sentiments there were among, say, the hippie movement, among some of these other movements of the 1960s, for good or for ill, they were scooped up by the left. They were included in this great cultural revolution. And you see this time and time again. Anytime there's some movement that does start to rear its ugly head, as it were, if it cannot be destroyed, it's co-opted. And I do think
Yeah.
that we're at a serious risk, if it hasn't already happened, of something similar like that happening. And I will say, we probably will get some things that are either good or even just look on paper that come out of this administration in the next 4 years. And you know what? You can take what you can get. You can be happy that say maybe, I don't know, the economy is more stabilized, just for an
Hmm.
example,
Hmm.
or maybe some of the excesses of, like, as that social liberalism are curtailed. You can take that. But remember, I need you guys to remember, I will repeat myself, that they owe you that. You do not have to give them anything in return. You do not owe them anything in return. They will try to extract something in return. Of course, the political interests, they'll try to lean on Trump, get whatever they can from him. But you, sitting right here listening to the show as the average person, you do not owe them your loyalty. You do not owe them your respect. You do not owe them anything. They are there to deliver on your promises, on the promises they made to you.
Yeah.
And if they don't, you don't need to defend them. And like I said, you don't even need to take one position. You can, take the positive with the Trump. You can praise that while also being harshly
Yeah.
critical. Once again, the rules we had during his first term were, look, you can go back and listen to all the shows we did during his first term. Pardon the quality issues. I know we were very, bare bones. We're still a very bare bones program, but even more so back then. Where, yeah, okay, there's going to be some good things that Trump can do, and you can find the guy funny. I think he's hilarious. I think he's losing his
He
edge with
is
age,
hilarious. Yeah.
but, which it happens. The man is 78. I'll say one thing about the inauguration speech: you could really see his age coming through. He was much
Yep.
less energetic. But once again, you're allowed to be objective about Trump. You're allowed to call him mixed bags, and you're allowed to be critical of him. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Especially now that the election is over, for those of you who still value the ritualistic ceremony of electoral democracy, who still thinks it makes some great difference. It's over now. We're in the administration. You can criticize him. You can take whatever level of civil action. I will encourage you all to be careful, because even when you do take legal action, they can still put you under a microscope for it. Now, I would never encourage anyone to do anything illegal. I'm just going to say that outright. Cover, all my bases here. But once again, even if you do choose public political activism, which I think is kind of stupid at this point, I don't think it has the effect it once did. Be careful. But once again, I will reiterate the point that Trump owes you. You do not owe Trump.
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely. Excellent. Wise advice. Um, yeah, I will say this. Okay. I mean, so why do they want him to win? Yes, of course, the Zionists want him. And number one, they had to first of all, they had to defeat the first alt-right, the alt-right that was explicitly not aligned, or those elements within that were not aligned with Jewish interests. So they had to say, well, they're Russian. Well, in a way, they gave away the game, because if they're Russian, well, that means they're not European, which would have almost identical interests as American. They're not Canadian, obviously, for the same reasons.
They might be
However,
Brazilian. They might be Latino.
you
I,
but you
I
could
kid. I kid.
see, yes, but you can see just like, this is my conspiracy theory. Okay, my conspiracy theory is elements within the American intelligence that were aligned, or just wanted, maybe not Biden, but wanted anybody but Trump. They may or may not be Democrats, but they wanted anybody else but Trump. They knew, like, COVID would do something either to China's economy or to America's economy, or both, right? Remember, it wouldn't be bad if it was for both, because Biden takes over Trump's position on China. It's not going to change that fundamentally, right? They have different ways of trying to achieve the same goals, but they're aligned in their basic ideas. China can't get Taiwan. We still have to be more economically and militarily more powerful than China, and we have to keep intimidating them until they break. They're just different ways of doing that, but they have the same goals. So I guess what I'm saying is the regime risked everything to get rid of Trump, right? They panicked, and they did everything to get rid of him, right? They must have thought, like, I guess, this time, the night before his inauguration, of course, he had the village people singing YMCA. Oh God, I thought they were going to do Macho Man. It's
That's
just,
that's
uh,
sad.
please tell me the Canada's gay but not America. Please try to tell me that again. Thank you very much. Please get real with yourselves. Anyhow, um, so my theory is that they wanted to destroy the economy, and they wanted him out.
period. And they got that, and they even had to like really affect the elections in order to make sure. And remember Trump the whole time? We're observing, we're keeping an eye on it. Like he did
Monitoring the
nothing.
situation.
Yeah, and people were fed up, and that's probably the strongest argument that the rigging itself wasn't enough. This other element of just people losing complete faith in him, right? Because he didn't do anything. So those were very, very desperate measures, and it was America could not do that again 4 years later, right? They have to restore faith in faith in all the institutions, right? Because, and of course now they will. Now they'll think like, oh, it's all fixed. Trump is back. It's all better now. A lot of them will think that. The majority will think that. They really will. And the less woke there is, the more they'll think that will be the proof in the pudding. That's how that's the calculus that they'll have.
And I don't want to dwell on the issue, but you saw, once again, almost immediately after Trump got elected, the debate about HB1s and quote unquote high skilled immigrants started. And a
Yes.
lot of people who, under normal circumstances, would be very critical of that decided, oh, I just trust Trump. I trust Musk. They'll do what's right. Clearly, it's part of a greater strategy. But once again, you'll get a lot of these people who will get one taste of victory and rest on their laurels for the rest of their lives, frankly. And
Hmm.
that's why you never get any. I shouldn't say that's the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why you never get any progress in the right direction, the direction that maybe you and I would like to see. Because,
Yeah.
look, I know power is top down, but there is still some influence from the bottom that can work
Yeah.
its way up.
It's
But
true. There
once
has to
again,
be a dialectic, right?
yes,
There's always a dialectic.
but once again, the right wing base, particularly in the Anglosphere, is much more willing to accept less than, say, for example, the left wing base. Whereas they're always whining, they're always kvetching. It's never enough. It's always you have to go further than the left on this issue, and they start to feel the heat, and they do. You get incremental moves towards the left from the, say,
Hmm.
democratic or liberal establishments in particularly Anglosphere countries, lesser extent European countries, but particularly Anglosphere countries. But on the right, you don't have that. It's Donald Trump won, and he's going to make America great again. No further action required.
Yes. 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 So yeah, they don't want that to they didn't want that to happen again. I remember when Trump lost in 2020, quote unquote lost. There were people. I remember various tweets, but one of my favorites was, "I don't ever want to hear another effing word about Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan had a rigged election again. I don't ever want to hear this shit again."
Remember when Lukashenko allegedly rigged the election?
Yeah, I know. And they can't afford that kind of parity, right? And now, if when it comes to places like Romania where they can shut out Georgescu, right? Then, well, Americans won't hear about it, because it's one of those, like you have to be kind of curious. You have to be kind of a curious person. You have to be kind of interested in a larger picture
Kind of
to,
autistic.
to know, it's kind of autistic like us to know about that. But most Americans won't care, you know.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
it is one of those things where they can't expect. I mean, perhaps you could say under better circumstances, being very provincial is a very noble quality. Keeping to yourself and your kin. But in the environment of mass media, when you live in a decrepit empire, it does become a weakness where you do get duped into a lot of things. And like I said, these are otherwise just fine people, very fine people, to quote
Yeah,
Donald
yeah.
Trump.
They
But like I said, in a mass media environment when the dynamics are so different, a provincial mindset, while desirable under normal circumstances, does become actively harmful not only to yourself but just frankly on a global scale, and does lead to just cascading effects that will eventually work their way home. And one thing I do fear in the next 4 years, and I brought this up over the course of the election after Trump got elected, is that part of the reason they did let Trump win is so he could be the public face of a lot of the American empire's chickens coming home to roost. If there is economic downturn, if there's foreign policy
Yes.
failures, if there's just anything that goes wrong in the next 4 years, as a result of not only Biden's administration, but just, I don't know, the past 20 years, just to give a time frame, since, say, 2001, since 9/11, if a lot of that stuff starts unraveling, they have somebody they hate to shoulder the blame for it.
Hmm. Hmm.
also do think he was uniquely malleable with his legal troubles. That you know, some agreements were made, and like I said, we'll see who snakes who because that's the game of politics. You can ride these people, you can ride their coattails to power, and if you're a skilled enough politician, you can screw them over and act in your own interest. We on a much smaller scale, on a much less significant scale, we have seen this somewhere like Hungary with Orban, and I'm not saying that entirely, but he was able to, in many ways, double cross the people who made him who he was. And I think number one because the Americans are the axis on which the world tilts. You don't have to like it. I'm not trying to be like egotistical about this. I'm just saying yes, global power emanates from Washington still. Love it or hate it.
Yeah.
It's much different circumstance with that, and also I don't think Trump or anyone around him is either politically skilled enough or willing to make a similar move. So
Hmm.
these are things to watch out for. But I think one of the biggest concerns I have over the next 4 years is that either bad decisions made in previous years, we see the fruition of that, or perhaps they pay less attention to certain issues to allow them to fall on Trump's shoulders. I said this throughout the course of the campaign with Ukraine. If they really want to cut it loose, if we really do get, say, Congress deciding to call the whole thing off and cut funding to Ukraine or start decreasing support for them, once again, that's a failure on Trump's shoulders, which number one makes him look bad. Number two is going to make him more hawkish in other theaters in order to make up for that loss of strength, as we had mentioned previously.
Yeah, well, Trump is doing an audit right now, but as we all know, there's all kind of black ops that the government will be doing, either behind his back or he'll pretend he doesn't know. But it'll be like the thing in Syria, where he
Yes,
says, "Oh, I'm
yes.
ordering my men back, but I'm going to save Al Qaeda first and then kill Soleimani." Um, so it'll be something like that. And now, how much can they give? Probably not as much as they've openly given, which is about $180 billion in 3 years.
All that for this.
Most of that went to American contractors, yes, right? But it's still taxpayers who are paying for it, right? And they're not seeing any returns. But and in a way they are seeing returns because the EU and Russia are integrating, and that's good for America because even China can't take advantage of that, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so I guess we'll have to see where this goes. Now, he's delayed except for Israel, of course. There's a few other countries, but Ukraine was not one of them. No aid for like 90 days. Did you read that?
Yes, 90-day moratorium on foreign
90 days
aid.
moratorium,
And I do think
right?
that there were some
In a way,
provisions under which Ukraine could receive, like monetary aid, for example, in order to keep the country propped up and keeping their civil servants paid. But in terms of like the military aid, as you discussed before, at several NATO ports, weapons are being held. A lot of the funding is being put on the back burner for that. But of course, Israel, Egypt, which plays into the Israel situation,
yeah.
and some aspects of Ukraine are exempt from that moratorium.
Right. Now, that's going to have the greatest amount of effect that's going to have, of course, will be in Ukraine. Right. That's where the effects of a reduction of aid will see the most amount because Ukraine is engaged in a war. And I guess we'll see. I guess by late April, mid to April, we'll see what happens. Right.
And with that being
We'll
said,
see what the Europeans can provide. We'll see if the lack of the levels of help that America has been able to provide. Because I mean, we've said this a million times, but Ukraine literally it can't even exist without America.
no, it's insolvent, and it's been that way ever since the beginning of the war, and arguably even a little bit before. But with all that being said, I did want to, just for one of our final subjects, actually loop back to Ukraine and the peace talks and the proposal with that. And that does get into the fact that I do think part of the reason why Trump is withholding at least some degree of aid to Ukraine is to force Zelensky to the bargaining table. And I don't think there's any question about that.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Because even though I think,
And he's signaling to Putin,
yes,
"I'm giving you 90 days to accomplish something big."
yes. And like I said, we'll see what the actual peace talks end up looking like. That I think the Russians will participate just in a obligatory sense, as I had said previously. But I am curious with that, beyond the question of a NATO moratorium for 20 years or whatever else, if number one, uh, we're actually going to get Zelensky to the negotiating table. Number two, if Trump is going to be amenable to the plan to, I don't know, maybe force another Ukrainian election by spring in 2025, and
Mhm.
that they might want a change in leadership in order to um, facilitate this process. Even though
That's a definite possibility.
that does raise the question, who would be the U.S.'s horse in that race, for example? Because if we are doing that in interest of trying to broker some sort of peace agreement, you don't want Zelensky, you don't want Klitschko, you don't want Poroshenko back in power. You don't want anyone from that faction. Arestovich, unfortunately, is off the table. As much as I would love to see that. But that reminds me, I'll have to cover. I'll have to end the show with an Arestovich comment because he was very poetic today. But that's aside the point.
Oh yeah, he was great.
But I mean, I don't know. They might build up some quote unquote dark horse candidate who takes the reins from Zelensky because
Are you gonna read some of the Aristovich stuff?
yeah, in a minute here
Okay.
after I finish talking about the potential for a Ukrainian election. But in terms of that,
Hurry up, get to the Aristovich
yeah,
part. I'm
I
so
know, I know.
I'm teasing. I'm teasing.
You
I'm
know what?
teasing.
Patience is a virtue.
It is. Probably the most immature man you know at my age, for sure.
That's why.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, number one, I would dispute that. Number two, it adds to the program. But
A yes or no answer.
realistically, I do see a situation where they do force Zelensky out of power, even just for a change in public appearance. They build up some dark horse candidate and put him in there in order to facilitate the negotiations with Russia, in order to reset Ukraine to the status quo, or at least as close to the status quo as they can. And I mean, it's either realistically, it's either that or let the entire thing fall apart and let Russia dictate terms, which Trump absolutely does not want to happen.
No, that would be un-American.
It would be a disaster. But because you asked for it, let me pull up his comments here. So the funniest thing I've heard in these 3 years is the statements about 200,000 peacekeepers. Lunatics. We should ask India for another 200 war elephants and then sing a song with them. Our God forgive me government does not understand the nature of this conflict, nor the reasons, nor the attitude of those who it turns to for help. It states that Putin, who started the war for the sake of quote unquote demilitarization of Ukraine, will perceive the increase in the number of forces opposing him as the best solution, and of course, will happily welcome this decision. It states in essence that the Western partners have 200,000 free troops, and they have nothing better to do than go to Ukraine. It states that in essence that peacekeepers should be a huge military contingent with a huge rear base, for which there's no chance for logistics. It states that peacekeepers should be ready for a direct confrontation with Russia, although no country in the world would do this for the sake of Ukraine, if this is not a one-time incident but a systematic military action. So, and then he says, in summary, the government does not want to realize what all the world is in and what they're saying, and the proposed measures are unrealistic and serve only one thing: the continuation of the war. Or maybe the second is the whole point. But 200 war elephants, Arestovich wants it. He's going to get them.
He's hilarious.
Yeah,
He's very funny.
I think
He's
Trump
very
dropped the
funny.
ball when he didn't appoint Arestovich as the special counsel to Ukraine for negotiations.
I wish Lex Friedman had interviewed him instead of
Yes,
Zelensky.
we could probably make that happen. Yeah,
Because I love how I love they're both arrogant, but the way Aristovich is aristocratically arrogant without being an aristocrat.
I mean, this man
Uh,
deserves to run a country. I don't care what country it is. He deserves to run a country.
he does. Such a he's like he's a little bit of a Saakashvili, you know, just a little bit.
Except more charm, much more charm.
More charm. He's more charming than Saakashvili. But there
Yes.
is a little bit of that. I'm obviously a snake, as you can tell.
Look, I'm just saying it needs to happen. Trump needs to talk to Arestovich, and the war will be over in 24 hours. Okay.
Can you imagine? Trump unveils Aristovich.
You know, I actually
Musk is patting him on the back.
I take it back. You know who should hire Arestovich?
Who?
Fico.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
You know, they'll have that pan-Slavic union in no time.
Oh yes.
Yeah,
Be good. It'll be good.
that's what needs to happen. But with all that aside, like I said, returning to the boring, serious part of this program is that at some level, if Trump is well informed enough, assuming that his intelligence agencies just haven't absolutely screwed him like they did the first time, he has to understand the reality that Russia wins this or we try to save face. And look, that might give us license to go into the Middle East later. We might have to tighten the screws on somewhere else. But fundamentally, he has to understand that. And like I said, I don't think he's entirely stupid. I think he has some sense of what that would look like. But yeah, the U.S. might need to look quote unquote weak in order to really save the reputation of the West at this point, to which degree it can be saved.
Yeah, there is the risk of that, right? There is the risk of if America looks really weak in this, right? Um, I mean, not that like the world is then going to attack. They're not. I mean, America is very well situated, but like, let's say the American Empire would feel differently about that. But again, let me reiterate, the closest member to the heart of the American Empire is Europe, particularly Britain. Now, Britain doesn't. I don't think there's any politician in Britain that actually can imagine Britain without America. I just it's not there, and which should be obvious because of everything I've said on the show tonight and that you have said, but Europe probably can, but that I think that I think makes Britain fearful, and because Britain is a smart country. I think they still want to be an important and well respected country, but they're in little power now. They're not what they used to be, and looking weak. The Americans rather looking weak makes them look weak, and I mean, I don't think Russia would go for revenge on Europe. I don't think that would happen.
Especially not
Uh,
under current leadership.
yeah, not under current leadership, and I don't think even the Russian people, they're not like that.
No,
Like
no.
there's several differences between the Russian people and the Ukrainians. One is that the Russians just they're sovereigntists. They like being sovereign, and the Ukrainians, I'm sorry, like they're not, and they're always going to look for a big partner that can like let them live in a sort of fantasy world where they can pretend that they're sovereign.
It was that way under the Poles. It was that way under the Austrians. It was that way under
Yeah,
the Germans in World War II, at least to some degree, and now
yeah.
under NATO and the American Empire.
If someone else has to pay you for your freedom, for your like, you're not really sovereign. Like
No,
that
no.
that's an
And I
oxymoron.
think
So
on your prior point, that the Russians are too pragmatic to hold that much of a grudge, and that they're willing to
yeah, they're
wipe the slate clean and look out what's actually in their best interest without letting rivalries and past bad blood affect it too much.
I'll give you an example. Okay, I'll give you an example. So the kind of videos that are published on Telegram. Okay, so there was another one from Kursk where 4 or 5 elderly people were killed in the basement of a home. The basements, in Eastern Europe, they're not in the home, they're outside in the yard, and it's just a space that's like maybe 4 or 5 feet high, right? And that's how much it is underground. And they've been tied up. Some of them were tortured, and grenades were thrown in, and they were just left to die there, including their dog, right, who they killed. Right, and there are Westoids and Ukrainians that just celebrate this kind of stuff. And then I saw another video of a Russian drone operator. Now, both sides are the most merciless blanks I have ever seen in the way they kill men who are like near death, anyways, with their drones. Both sides. However, here is this drone footage. This SUV is driving along a dirt road through a field, and it stops. Something must have given it a clue that a drone is following it. The vehicle comes to a halt. People exit from the left and from the right. From the right is a man with a child, and he's running away with it. The child's not a baby or a toddler. It's bigger. It's like half his height, right? But he's running away with this child, which I assume is his son, from what I saw. The drone operator swerves and just avoids and doesn't hit anything, right? If they were Russian, the Ukrainians would have hit them, and the Westoids and Ukrainians would have cheered it on. That's the other difference. And we've talked about this on the show before. Even before the SMO, even before the threat of the SMO, Ukraine was the only federation that Russia paid its entire debt. Every other federation in the Soviet Union had to pay their way out, half and half. Russia paid their debt. And
And
then when they racked up another debt from 1991 to the 2000s, the Russians paid off that debt too.
even post Maidan as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that second debt they paid off in 2017. It's these. I'm sorry, but they're like the basketball Americans of Eastern Europe. I'm sorry, right?
No, it's true, and that you do get this mentality. It is in ironically enough, because Ukraine is physically a very large nation, it is a very much of a statelet mentality. And that, I know you brought up the example earlier, these people behave like what you'd expect Albanians to. Just these spurned petty nationalists who will do anything to get one over on the guys who wronged them 300 years ago.
Yeah,
And no nation would be able to survive that mindset. And you look at just the raw figures of post-Soviet Ukraine, it had the makings of what should have been a very successful nation. You had about 50 million people, you had heavy industry, you had resources, you had ports, and especially if they were able to balance the relationship between Russia and the West, they would have been a very prosperous nation. They would have been the middleman for a great number of deals. But they threw it away once again, all for petty nationalism, all
yeah,
for getting one over on the Turco-Mongol, Russian hordes. And I know I've said this to you, and I've probably said this in previous shows. I once again will ask, just in general, what terms could the Russians have imposed on Ukraine that justify the level of sacrifice that they've made in this war? What, how unfavorable the terms have to be to justify the sacrifices Ukraine made? You would think that the Russians want to just cleanse this land and repopulate it all with Russian settlers, which is simply not the case, especially considering the fact that many of the people living in the parts of Ukraine where the war is heaviest are actual descendants of Russian settlers that land
hmm
after
hmm
after it was annexed by the Russian Empire in the late 18th century, after it was made safe from slave raiders from Crimea that were driven out.
yeah. By
That
Turks.
Yes, Turkish and Tatar slave raiders that were driven out by the Russians. But once again, what terms are so harsh that justify fighting to I mean, let's take another example that might look similar on the surface, but is different. Look at the lead up to World War One with the terms that Austria tried to impose on Serbia. There were 10 terms, I don't remember them all off the top of my head, but the Serbs were willing to concede to all of them except one. And the Austrians still went to war against Serbia. And at that point, Serbia did fight the war and it ended up losing, I think, about 25% of all adult men in World War One.
Yep, yep.
Uh, in that case, once again, when you have a country where you're willing to compromise with 9 out of 10 demands and they still insist on war, I think at that point, yeah, you are at a point where you have no choice but to fight a war where you lose 25% of your adult men. Just to put it in perspective. Ukraine, on the other hand, they were never in any situation even resembling that.
That's right. As we've often said, Russia was never prepared for this. They didn't even go in the right time with the right amount of men. They weren't even trained as well as they could have been. Um,
And the Russian troops
on
outright
paper,
admitted
the
they were,
Ukrainians had 900,000 men.
yeah.
Like, I mean, Putin for 8 years would not recognize Donbass, even just the areas that they controlled is part of Russia, the way he did with Crimea. Even in the original peace deal in Turkey, he was willing to like lease them Crimea, like pay a lease for it, like crazy shit. Like that literally would, that's what scares me about him. That literally would have ended his career, quite frankly. In a way, the Ukrainians, just from a career move, did him a favor. But I mean, it's I guess it's providence, honestly. I don't know what to say, but that's not, that's not like, again, it's like this, how Sunnis think like there was a Sunni genocide.
Oh.
But they weren't the ones committing the genocide, it was the Shia. I laugh because I'm sorry, like literally the stupidest people. Like I read an article of a Palestinian who joined ISIS in Africa, and I'm going, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're like, ISIS literally works for American interests, you know, and like, I mean, you're not even helping your own people. And
No,
I said this in the missiles and nukes chat, and the guy says, it was another chap, but anyways, he says, like they're satanic. I'm a Sunni Muslim. They're satanic, ISIS, that is. And he goes, but what do you expect us to do? We're weak. We can't fight Israel. It's like, how about like fight like a man, like those guys, like the Hamas guys? How about like, I don't know, fight like Hezbollah? How about like fight like the Houthis? How about like, don't fight, don't topple Assad, and don't join ISIS?
yeah,
Like that's a good middle of the road.
it always goes back to this where when it's time for regime change in Iraq, in Syria, and Libya, they're the first to sign up. They're the first to go on a glorious jihad. But when the war is brought to their village, they're the ones fleeing.
Yeah, it's pathetic. Honest to
Like
God.
how? And look, I'm by no means pro-Israel, and I have a great deal of sympathy for the Palestinians, especially the ones who suffer from this war. But at what point? How do you help the people who do that? Like how?
Yeah.
And that's obviously not all of them, but like,
Yeah. I
but
mean,
yeah,
we should make that clear.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
But
It's not all of them. It's not even. I don't even know if it's a majority. But
no,
I mean,
but it's
although
there.
we did see a few celebrating when Assad was toppled, I'm going. I mean, of course, some of them went as refugees to Lebanon and to Syria, and they're not Shia Palestinians; they're Sunni, but they need relief.
Yes, and I mean it's we've gone over this many times where it is
Mm,
that same case, and I think it's all very applicable to the petty nationalists of Eastern Europe, particularly the Ukrainians, the Baltic states, and the Albanians. I hesitate to say the Poles because I think they still have. I
mm.
don't want to give them too much credit because they do make a lot of stupid decisions, but I still do think they're a bit more grounded in reality than all the aforementioned. Uh,
Mm. Yeah,
but
they have to be more sober.
yes, um,
The other ones bloviate a lot because in a way they're coached to be that way.
yes, and once again, it's always to the detriment of these nations. They simply do not benefit from it, and they get used as pawns. And if you want the ultimate example for that, the last big point I'll make for this episode is I insist everyone go back and read the Open Society Foundation publications. These aren't secret documents. These aren't leaked things. These are things that the Open Society Foundation openly published in 1993 about the future of Eastern Europe and Russia, about if Russia will not come to terms with our demands, we're just going to prop up all these various Eastern European nations to fight them until they do.
Yeah, yeah, and they'll go through the same rigmarole, the same stupid, tired narrative. Russia's trying to reestablish the Soviet Union, like all of this kind of stuff. Like, give me a break.
Yeah, it's the same thing over and over again, and unfortunately, there's a large enough segments of the population in a lot of these countries. The Baltic states they're not really big enough to pose a threat, but say countries that are a bit more substantial, Poland, Romania, that can be talked into these narratives. And so long as they have the funding, so long as they have people whispering in their ears that you can take the Russians, you can stand up, we got your back, blah 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 blah, they will continue to do this. And until cooler heads prevail in those countries, like I know Georgescu is one candidate and one guy, but he was a step in the right direction, at least as far as Romania is concerned. And there are even some minor voices in Poland who are a bit more level-headed on the issue as well.
Yeah.
I should give them credit. But so long as those types are politically marginalized, you're going to have these countries that are even in NATO stumble themselves into the same trap that Ukraine stumbled itself in, where they're going to sacrifice. You know, I don't know. Let's just steal the figure from Serbia from World War One. Quarter their adult male population, and gain nothing for it.
Yeah.
And I mean, even if you do, let's say like, okay, we reach critical mass, and these countries, wave after wave, charge at the Russians until the Russians just can't take it anymore. Okay, Russia collapsed. What did you gain? Your
Yeah,
society
yeah,
is still
yeah. I
broken.
mean,
Your society. Let's say if I don't know Ukraine's war effort, if I don't know the Russians are so scared of Trump's sanctions that they just collapse tomorrow. What does Ukraine gain? What maybe access to resources that are going to get plundered and embezzled across every corner of the globe that are
yeah,
going to
like
be managed.
by BlackRock.
Yeah, you think that Ukraine is going to see any of the fruits of this war, even if that Russia does collapse and we get unfettered access to all the resources? No, Ukraine will be left to rot like a carcass because that's what it looks like right now. It will not be rebuilt. In fact, they'll probably import populations from all four corners of the globe to quote unquote repopulate it, and they'll have to live with the same nonsense the rest of us do. And that's what's going to look like. Ukraine is condemned to a future of stagnation and decline, probably the most severe in Europe. And this was, I don't want to say entirely by their choice, because there are plenty of Ukrainians who, once again, were saying did not want to fight the Russians, but thanks to the choice of a handful of Western Ukrainians and their political representatives, have to suffer these consequences. And simply, there's no coming back for Ukraine. And the only parts of Ukraine that we will see rebuilt are places like Mariupol and places that have actually joined the Russians because they're the only ones with the capital and the resource to actually rebuild them and has any interest in rebuilding them. Western
Mhm.
Ukraine is going to be a black hole in Europe. That's simply what it is. And the minute that they get not even to the European Union, but access to Western Europe, access even to other parts of Eastern Europe, they're all going to flee like rats from a sinking ship. And frankly, I can't blame them because there's no opportunity there. It's already not the economically productive part of the country. That's all in the east. That's the industry, the resources. That's all in Donbass. That's all in Zaporozhye. That's all in Dnipropetrovsk. And when Ukraine is severed from that, which they almost certainly will be, the rest of the country is going to go into a further economic freefall than it is. And like I said, everyone will be eager to get out. I frankly can't blame them. And it's just going to be a black hole in Europe that nobody wants to touch. And it's going to be the destruction of a nation in the most literal sense in real time.
Remember, the U.S. wants Europe weak,
Oh,
and
absolutely. Yeah.
keeping Eastern Europe weak and disorganized and unable to connect with Western Europe debilitates both, right? Which is in America's interest to do that.
And to continue on your point with that, they would love nothing more for, say, Poland or Romania or Hungary or Slovakia to look like to look like Ukraine in that regard. They don't
Yeah.
care if they condemn these nations to the waste, so long as they, even if they are just scorched earth, even if they are just piles of ashes, so long as the Russians and the Western European cannot build bridges through them, they've accomplished their goal.
Yes. Yeah. That's the main point.
But were there any last minute topics that you wanted to get into?
Uh, yeah, just very brief. You know those cables, the three cables in the last year or two.
Oh, those.
But
Please go on.
so Washington Post had an article basically saying they were an accident. So yeah, the Chinese and the Russians didn't cut them. I don't know what they're going to do with one of the ships that they seized. Like, and this was, they love creating this panic. In Europe, Russia's going to invade. In Germany, they had like the O plan, like the O plan. That sounds like it sounds ridiculous. It's funny to me. But it's a plan where they show strategically what roads, highways, railroads are going to be used to transport logistics,
the dead, even coffins. In case of a war that they suspect could begin in 2029, they're waiting for Putin to get out of office and for Trump to get out of office, and that's when they're going to go for round two on this.
Yeah, I can't add anything to that because you put it so succinctly that that's exactly what they're waiting for, and that if Trump can accomplish a ceasefire or some sort of fractured peace deal, that's just time for rearmament. If they do get, say, Russia to make certain concessions, and that, as unpleasant as it looks as far as the Russians are concerned, once again, the collapse of the Kiev government and the dictation of peace terms at this point look like the only long-term solution as far as the Russians are concerned.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm just sending you something. I'm asking you to please post this. It's just too good. It is literally like one of the best things I've ever seen. It's so hilarious.
Oh,
It's
oh
so
yes,
ridiculous.
regarding this, hold on, let me.
Yeah, it's so hilarious and ridiculous. Like,
uh, so, for the context, I'm sure everyone knows that fortunately many of the J6ers did get the pardons that
it
they
is
were
cool
due.
that
Um,
happened.
but here's here's one of the posts from that.
I just got the news from my lawyer. I got a pardon, baby. Thank you, President Trump. Now I'm gonna go buy some more guns. I love this country.
Uh, I have to say, if anyone has a right to feel vindicated, it's these guys.
American Shaw, man. Oh my God, it's just so ridiculous. I guess just for of course, Musk did his Roman salute.
Oh yeah, that's right.
I guess should we show it or no? I
I
mean,
ever
I guess
everyone's seen it.
everyone has seen it. Yeah, I mean, ever since he brought up those H-1B visas, he tried to shame. Not that he shouldn't, but like it's the order of things, right? Like he should have shamed um, Stammer for the Pakistani rape gangs in Britain, and then talk about HB1 visas, not the other way around.
Yeah.
This salute was literally just he's just trying to win people back. Okay, that's all. Remember, they have to bring MAGA into the GOP.
Yeah, and
They
he
have to
did
bring
it
them
in
in.
like it's funny. He straddled that line where it's like, oh, it's just a hand gesture, or if you want it to be, it can be
Yeah.
that. Like it's,
Yes.
I mean, like I said, given his personality, I don't think it's surprising that he would do something like that. And let's be honest, I think he does revel in the tension, positive or negative, that the media gives him. I think he's just that kind of person.
Times of Israel had an article.
Oh boy,
Did he just do a salute that we? It's like if their title says implies they don't know, then they don't care.
whoa, guys, we got it all wrong. Okay, Elon Musk may have thrown up a Roman, but he said Slava Ukraina, so it's okay.
Yeah, yeah. Then I'm just saying the Hebes don't care. They
No, they
don't. I
don't.
don't.
They don't.
They
But
don't. Like if they thought he really stepped out of line, he'd be on another plane to Auschwitz or the Wailing Wall by now. So,
yeah,
and who knows? By next week that could happen.
yeah,
But
it could. And I mean, with a lot of these elites, once again, I'll bring up the point I always bring up. The reason why regulations exist now, they're not only to screw over a lot of potential competitors, but it's to keep the oligarchs in line because they all violate these regulations. They all violate these
hmm
business
hmm
practices. And for the ones who step out of line, then that gets brought up. Then that gets prosecuted. But for the ones who play ball, that's once again, it's a failsafe against these people. It's not for like
yes,
actual interest, and because there's so many regulations and business practice laws they could nail Musk on, but because he's playing ball right now, they won't. And if he were to really ever step out of line, while he does have the money to make it a fight, they could drag him to the courts if they wanted to.
yep.
But I suppose that's the final point I had on that, and um, thank you everyone for tuning into this first episode of the post-democracy war report. It's been nice knowing you all.
Post democracy.
Democracy dies in darkness, as our friends over the Washington Post tell us behind our
Woo!
paywall. But you know what? That's just the name of the game, and I hope you're all happy with the orange fascism that we have. And once again, it's been nice knowing you. And you know what? Hillary was right. She tried to warn you all. If only we voted
If
for
only we
Hillary
li-
in 20. I
if only
can't.
we listened.
I can't even finish that sentence.
It's so ridiculous.
No,
That's why.
it is. Why am I not 50 points ahead? You might ask. That will always live rent free in my head. That quote. I mean, look. In all seriousness, through the good and the ill, if Trump has been one thing, he's given us stuff to talk about.
Always is. Yeah.
So thank you everyone for tuning into another episode of the War Report. We'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.